Welcome to my new series where I tell you everything that you never knew about former Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt because you were too busy having a big giggle about the fact that there's a pool named after a head of state who drowned. Once you do something that makes history, you don't get to change the thing that you're known for. For example, in the late 90s, the band Radiohead released 3 back-to-back smash hit classic albums. But back in 1993, Radiohead said, and because of that, if you search Radiohead on Spotify today, the only song that will come up is Creep Radiohead, and then the rest of the page is just completely blank. This pool is Harold Holt's Creep. Harold Holt vanishing into the ocean was so funny, we forgot everything else about him. Which is so sad, because if he could be here today, which he can't because fish ate him, but if he could, he'd tell you that he was so much more than a conservative politician who cheated on his wife all the time. He was the first Prime Minister in Australia's history to cheat with his wife, who was married to an Air Force pilot for the first 7 years of their relationship. Which sounds underhanded, but you'd do it too if the last time you publicly dated someone your dad found out, met her, proposed to her, she said yes, dumped you, and then became your stepmother. Which is one of the many reasons why Harold Holt was extremely secretive about his personal life, including on December 17th, 1967, when he took his mistress to Cheviot Beach, Portsea, went for a swim, got swept away, and nobody was there to rescue him because nobody knew he was there. Anyway, welcome to the series. We have a lot to get through. Episode 2 of everything you didn't know about that time the Prime Minister vanished into the ocean and we named a pool after him. There's a long-standing taboo around questioning Holt's state of mind before he vanished. And to give you an idea of how it's enforced, when Holt disappeared, the coroner's office wasn't legally allowed to investigate because his body was never recovered, which is a bad reason. But that law changed in 1985, which allowed the state coroner to spring into action and hand down this completely useless verdict in 2005. And what's interesting is how the media responded to this. See if you can spot a pattern here. Here's the Sydney Morning Herald, here's the ABC, and here's the Age. And just for fun, the Herald Sun actually published this. Harold Holt died happy. If you don't count his last seconds as a powerful undertow dragged him under turning order. Oh, drop my glasses. These articles blur the line between genuine concerns and wild conspiracy theories. And as a result, Holt's political allies have never had to answer any tough questions, like, how can you say that he was happy? He had his brother's funeral in March, and then by November he had to call a press conference to reassure people, oh no, I'm not drunk and slurring my words. That's just all the morphine pills I've been taking for my chronic spinal cord injury. Anyway, my doctor told me don't swim. I'm going to go for a swim on this beach named for a maritime disaster. And the only response we've ever gotten from the press or people close to Holt is, oh, the CIA did not make him do any of that. Which is not an answer to that question at all. But it's somehow still less embarrassing and concerning and suspicious than the truth. Which is what we're going to dive more into next episode, so stick around. Episode 3 of everything you never knew about that time the Prime Minister drowned and then we named a pool after him. His spear gun had sunk into the sand and his lungs were gurgling with salt water. McGilvery saw Holt and Diane struggling to get ashore, their arms interlaced. Holt's face was puce-coloured. He was hyperventilating and barely breathing. Together, his 2 friends helped him towards a rock and hooked his hand into a hole. It took a quarter of an hour to get him ashore. He reeled onto the beach, vomiting water. His snorkel had started leaking and he was unable to get back to the beach to change it, for the tide had started to turn. One of the notorious Cheviot rips had caught him, dragged him over the rocks, and entangled him in kelp. From the car, Zara saw the trio struggling back towards her. I've always dreaded something like this happening, she told them. She thanked them for saving her husband's life. It was the closest he had ever come to drowning. Had he been alone, he almost certainly would have drowned. The cuts on his torso and legs could be masked, as could any public knowledge of what had occurred. End quote. The events of that excerpt took place at Cheviot Beach on the 20th of May, 1967, at the exact same place that Holt would return to 7 months later and utter his last words. I know this beach like the back of my hand. And if that sounds strange and a bit haunting given the context, stick around, you have no idea. We have a lot to get through. So this is my 3D model of the Harold Holt Swim Center, and this is where the big fish goes. Time to model the big fish. Some quick stats about the big fish. Boom, 12 meters long. Boom, it's a marlin. Boom. Yeah, look, there's no information about this fish anywhere I could find, but it's absolutely massive. It would have cost a lot of money. Surely there's a plaque somewhere. So I thought, all right, I've got to go and visit the pool in person. And it didn't go well. I ran out of time. And if I'm being completely honest, it's my fault. I spent too long getting dressed because I wear jeans everywhere, but you can't wear jeans to the pool to take
photos. All I could picture was I'd be taking my little pictures and then I'd hear some beefy dad yell out like, "That guy's taking pictures of people's kids." And I'd be like, "No, I'm just a patron." And they'd be like, "Go through his bag, he's wearing jeans." And they would find that I didn't have any swimmers because I hate swimming. And they'd be like, "Put him in jail, eat him, swallow him whole." I'm just here for the architecture. But no, I'd be thrown in jail. So here's my outfit that I wore, and I was too stressed out by wearing shorts to get a photo with the fish. So it's me next to the bust of Harold Holt that they have there. So stick around for more about Harold Holt, the man, the myth, the pool.
My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this nice wall with 3 hand dryers on it yet, so we got to do that today. The weekend of his disappearance, Harold Holt was on holiday because work was going really badly. Namely, he was embroiled at the pointy end of the VIP aircraft affair, accused of overusing his private jet. So basically, his opposition in the Senate had been like, just give us the flight logs, we'll publish them, and then the public can decide whether you've overused your private jet. And he said, we don't actually keep flight logs, which people began to suspect was a lie when one of Holt's colleagues went behind his back and immediately produced all of the flight logs. And now Holt is being credibly accused of deliberately misleading Parliament, which could cost him his job forever. Which, if you are Harold Holt, is your entire life. His wife literally said about him, he has no friends. All he does is work and cheat on me. So he was about to lose the only thing that really mattered to him over a complete non-issue. It had been in the news for years that maybe the government's overusing jets, and no one had ever really cared. But it didn't become front page headline news until he started lying about it so incompetently that everyone started going, okay, this guy is clearly up to something. All of this leads up to a Senate election, and the Liberal National Coalition gets smashed. They lose 2 seats and lose the majority they've held there for 12 years. And everybody is like, this is Holt's fault. So what does he do? He takes a stand and runs away to his beach house to go and do his favorite thing, which is cheat on his wife and die. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this drink tap in it yet. So with the magic of computers, I'm going to quickly make that today. The day before he vanished, Harold Holt was under doctor's orders not to play tennis or drink alcohol. So he spent all day playing tennis, and then that night he had dinner and drinks with his mistress Marjorie Gillespie and her husband, whose name is Winton. Now, according to his first official biographer, he definitely shouldn't have been drinking and playing tennis, but it wasn't a big deal. And he was definitely taking painkillers for shoulder pain, but it wasn't a big deal. So when he did finally drown, it was unforeseeable. And if you think it was, or you think there's more to any part of this story, you are a rabid conspiracy theorist. Now, there's a small hiccup here because there is one person that they forgot to ask for information, Holt's doctor. And according to him, Holt didn't have minor shoulder problems. He had a chronic spinal cord injury where one of his vertebrae in his upper back was worn down so much it was 50% the size of a healthy vertebrae. And it was pressing on a nerve and intermittently causing him to lose control of his right hand and causing him so much pain that Cloak prescribed him morphine pills to manage it. Now, you might be tempted to think, oh, someone must have paid him or threatened him into silence. No, they didn't have to, because this man is Australian. So when a news crew came to his house 20 years after Holt's disappearance, they were like, don't you think that maybe this x-ray you hung on to is extremely important evidence? He just goes, yeah. But he didn't speak up for 20 years. Because no one asked. I always loved how exposed all of the structural elements are in this pool. So today I'm going to tell you about my favorite part of the Harold Holt Swim Center, which is these steel columns. These pillars hold up the entire indoor swimming structure, but they all taper down to these tiny little bolts. And if you're an architecture nerd, you're getting extremely excited because these bolts are actually hinges, because this structure is supported by a 2-hinge arch system, or more specifically, a 2-hinge truncated parallel corded girder truss. All of which I learned from this absolute weapon of a book. Anyway, if you're unfamiliar with the 2-hinge system, this is a solid steel span, and it heats up during the day and expands a great deal. And if you didn't have this hinge here, that bowing and flexing would put terrible strain on these steel pillars. And what's even cooler and what differentiates this 2-hinge system from the one in the Sydney Harbour Bridge, for example, is that this one is indoors. And what that means is that in the morning when the sun hits the roof and the heat radiates through into these steel beams and they expand, what happens is it acts like a giant diaphragm, expanding the volume of the room and inhaling air inwards. So if you swim here like I did heaps when I was a kid, you are swimming inside of a giant iron chest cavity. And even better than that, if you get up in the morning and close all the doors and bring some tape and a piece of hose and a Gatorade bottle, you could turn the entire pool into the world's largest and first Gatorade enjoying Memorial Swim Center. Anyway, stay tuned for more about the man, the myth, and the pool, Harold Edgar Holt. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this accessible aqua-size pool, so today we're going to do that. The morning of his disappearance, Harold Holt called up his next-door neighbor and mistress, Marjorie Gillespie, and says to her, "I'm going to go to the beach. Would you like to come?" And she says, how about I check to see who else wants to come? And he says, "No, I'm coming over anyway." So while Harold is on his way from next door, Marjorie Gillespie goes out of her house, up the street to the tennis courts, and manages to rope in her daughter, her daughter's boyfriend, and one of their mates, all of whom are under the age of 28, next to no relationship with the Prime Minister. And to give you an idea of how hastily tacked on these other guests were, when investigators asked the young people at that beach that day, what did you talk to the Prime Minister about before he vanished into the ocean forever? They said, "We talked about fish." Now, Harold Holt, when he invited Marjorie Gillespie to a secluded walk on his private beach, there is no way that his intention was for her to bring along a 28-year-old small business owner from Armidale so that they could make small talk about fish together. And if you're still not convinced, in the article I'm pulling from, published a few months after Holt's disappearance, that's all Gillespie's side of the story. But when they interviewed the other young people and were like, what were you doing at the beach with the Prime Minister? They said, we weren't tag-alongs. He invited all of us. Which is the kind of discrepancy that you'd hope a journalist at the Age would point out, given that the Prime Minister just died. But they didn't. And this is a scary thought, but I think I'm the first person to even notice. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have these all-terrain mobility chairs, so we'd better do that. 90 minutes before vanishing forever, Harold Holt's behind the wheel with passenger Marjorie Gillespie. Holt's invitation that morning had been to vaguely go and check out Cheviot Beach, but they drive straight past it. Gillespie never explains why or how, but Holt changes his mind and goes, "We're going to go the extra 10 minutes all the way to the tip of Point Nepean, because there's a famous yacht due to pass by, and maybe we can catch a glimpse of it." Which they absolutely don't. They are several hours late. So after aimlessly standing around, they hop back in the car and backtrack 10 minutes back to Cheviot Hill. What did the Prime Minister talk about in the last 10-minute drive of his life? To quote Marjorie Gillespie, "The contents of my heart are not the property of the cops." Queen. They finally arrive at Cheviot Hill, and this is not a commercial tourist spot. The only way to get down to the beach is a rock scramble down a 15-meter high cliff. And from the top, you can see the entire beach, and conditions that day are atrocious. It's high tide, the surf is furious. You have 5-meter high waves, and they are riddled with massive driftwood planks, visibly smashing into the cliffs nearby, because Cheviot Beach is right next to a commercial shipping lane. And those planks have been thrown overboard by dodgy cargo ship captains because lighter vessels pay less import tax. Up until this point in the day, swimming has been out of the question. But looking out at those conditions, that makes Harold Holt stop, and he turns around and he says, "I forgot my swim trunks." And then he runs back to his car to go and get them. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this door frame that's too big and this stuff, so we're going to do that today. The last thing Harold Holt ever does on land is get back from his car with his swimmers and a string bag containing a newspaper, 2 cans of bug spray, and 2 cans of warm beer. So he catches up to the group and he says to Marjorie Gillespie, "Perhaps one of the boys would enjoy a beer?" And she responds by marching to the opposite end of Cheviot Beach to sunbathe, leaving Harold Holt alone with her 20-year-old daughter Vina and her boyfriend and their friend Alan Stewart. To give you an idea of the vibe, imagine you are Vina Gillespie. To your left is Harold Holt, the man who is currently destroying your parents' marriage. And to your right is Alan Stewart, who you only know because he's your brother-in-law. And bearing in mind it's December, that January, he lost control of his car, got into a car crash, and killed your older sister. And now, because Holt is so desperate for alone time with your mum, they've said, "You guys can have a separate car and follow us." So all morning, you've been getting driven around by Alan Stewart, who, along with your boyfriend, is currently being propositioned for a day drinking sesh by the Prime Minister. So with all of those factors in mind, how long can they sustain a conversation? The answer is 3 minutes. Before Harold Holt does what any of us would do in that situation, which is climb a rock and dive into the ocean and swim out to sea, never to be seen again. But not before uttering his immortal last words. "I know this beach like the back of my hand." To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center is giving me a stress headache, so I'm just going to do these little chairs today. When Harold Holt said, "I know this beach like the back of my hand," and then jumped in the water and drowned, what did he mean by that? This is something that I've been curious about for a long time, and now that I've read 2 of his biographies and spent 18 months reading articles about him, it's pretty safe to say that this man never meant anything by anything he ever said. I'll give you an example. So towards the end of his career, his popularity was in the absolute toilet. And not only were his 2 most senior cabinet members threatening to blow up the whole coalition and cost him his job, but Vietnam War protesters were holding vigils outside of his house. They nearly flipped his car. And anytime he tries to talk in public, people are booing, chanting over him, and nailing him in the center of the forehead with paper airplanes. And photographers are there to capture the whole thing. So all of this new scrutiny turns him from this like young kind of fresh face for the Liberal Party into this drawing. And that's Gough Whitlam in the background digging his grave for him. So what does this have to do with his last words? In response to all of this, Harold Holt changes nothing about anything he is saying. And instead he does the opposite. He uses words as a battering ram and then brags to people like, yeah, I got booed, but they didn't win because I kept talking. And it's this ratio of 100% effort and perseverance and 0% brain power that was the defining feature of his personality his whole life. And if you would like to hear more about how much of an absolute dud he was, stick around for more. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still doesn't have this complicated pool section, and let me know if I'm procrastinating, but instead of doing this, I converted the pump house into a little office space for myself because I needed somewhere to put a TV trolley so that I could roll it out and then show you this fancy map that I made. This little patch of water between the towns of Portsea and Queenscliff is called the Rip, and it's a 3.5 kilometre wide opening into the largest bay in the southern hemisphere, Port Phillip Bay. The reason it's called the Rip is that tidal currents tend to max out at 2 knots or 1 metre per second. Here at the Rip, it's not uncommon to see tidal currents going as fast as 8 knots. Now, to give you an idea of how strong of a current that is, firstly, Michael Phelps's top speed in his prime was 4.8 knots. And secondly, here is all of the shipwrecks. Between the year 1835 and 1950, within this red circle, 120 vessels were wrecked. And of those 120, 66 of them happened within this much smaller circle, which is a 4-kilometre radius around, you guessed it, Harold Holt's favourite swimming spot. An area so dangerous that the Victorian state government had to leap into action and mandate the use of life jackets there in 2012. And also not actually at Cheviot Beach, just nearby-ish. I have more to show you about this map, so stick around. Oh, and I finished the pool area as well. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs this chaotic pool area, so today I will do that. A question I've been trying to answer is, did Harold Holt know what he was in for when he jumped in the water that day? It'd be nice to say something definitive like, oh, he damn well knew the risks. But to say that confidently, I would have to be a close personal friend of Harold Holt. And I'd also have to be an expert, someone like Milton Napthine, president of the Portsea Surf Lifesaving Club. But what if Milton was wrong? What if Holt also didn't know he was swimming next to the Petriana Reef, named after the 1903 wreck of the SS Petriana, Australia's first major oil spill? And maybe Harold Holt didn't know that the captain of that ship was British, but his crew were Chinese and Malay, and so while the captain was given a hotel room, his crew were detained offshore and then deported to Singapore. Maybe he didn't know that Captain William Kerr, when he found out what had happened to his crewmen, went to the press and sparked an international incident by calling the White Australia policy a disgrace to the British Empire. Maybe Harold Holt, who was immigration minister for 7 years, didn't know about any of that. And maybe when Harold Holt went swimming at Cheviot Beach without wearing flippers, maybe he didn't know that in 1887, 35 people drowned at the wreck of the SS Cheviot, and that wreck had been caused by a loss of propeller power, allowing the current to smash the boat into the rocks so hard that pieces of the SS Cheviot had been washing up on Cheviot Beach, including these 2 portholes donated to the Queenscliff Maritime History Museum by local skin diver Harold Edgar Holt. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this staircase because, frankly, it's going to be a nightmare. But I love you, so I'm going to make it today. So Harold Holt is in the water being pulled out to sea by a nasty rip current. What happens next? Well, on the beach is Alan Stewart, who notices that the Prime Minister is roughly a kilometre away, being dunked underwater by giant waves. Thinking quickly, he leans over to Vina Gillespie and he says, "Does he always do this?" No? Okay, I'm going to go and do my favourite thing, which is be really bad at driving. So he hops in his car. The nearest phone is a 15-minute driveway down a narrow service road, the speed limit of which is 20 kilometres an hour. Alan Stewart goes 180, nearly runs the car off of the road, gets the nearest phone, and while he's calling for help, he watches while his car rolls backwards down into a gully because he forgot to pull the handbrake. Total time saved, roughly 5 minutes. Did that make a difference? Absolutely not. Help is 90 minutes away because Australia doesn't have any search and rescue helicopters yet. We only get our first one in 1972, which is 5 years later. And so fast forwarding a couple hours, Alan Stewart, having helped absolutely no one, hops in his car, says his farewells, and then crashes into a press photographer's car so badly that he winds up in hospital with a fractured skull and arm and pelvis. So good on you, Alan Stewart, for helping absolutely no one, risking multiple lives, and then doing something much, much worse than any of that, which is live in Armidale. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have these big red poles, and that is unacceptable, so I'd better make those today. Now, I will admit that it is a little bit weird that the Australian Prime Minister went missing right next to a giant, ultra-secret spy base, which at first blush raises an interesting question. How can our top spies be so close to our Prime Minister disappearing, but then not be involved? But it also raises a second, much funnier question, which is, if it's an ultra-secret spy base, how come everybody knows about it? So the public first hears about ACES in November 1972 when investigative journalists publish a report, which is never officially acknowledged by the government, until 2 years later, when former Australian Prime Minister Billy McMahon confirmed its existence on television because he forgot it was meant to be secret. Now, as for how we know specifically about the base on Swan Island next to where Harold Holt disappeared, I gotta tell you about the ACES raid bungle. So in November of 1983, a dozen trainee ACES operatives checked into the Melbourne Sheraton Hotel to conduct a simulated hostage rescue operation. See, what they were meant to do was to quietly talk their way into the hotel room and then quietly get an actor out. Now, it's unclear why they did what they did next or how it was ever approved by ACES management, but they requisitioned for this job 2 silenced submachine guns, 3 pistols, a sledgehammer, a crowbar, and balaclavas for the whole unit. And then to maintain their cover story as being a bucks party, they booked themselves into room 007 for the weekend and ran up a $70 bar tab, which in 1983 is enough to buy well over 85 beers. So then, instead of quietly talking their way into the target hotel room, they smashed the door down with sledgehammers. So the hotel manager calls the police and goes up, and he finds 12 masked men carrying a wet, half-naked man down the corridor because the hostage is role-playing having been drugged, so he was naked in the bathtub when they knocked the door down. And then instead of explaining the situation, they escorted the manager at gunpoint down into the crowded hotel lobby, held everybody captive at gunpoint, before escaping in their getaway cars and getting arrested by local police less than 5 minutes up the road. And then the entire thing was in the newspapers the very next day because they told the cops that they were spies. And that ensuing inquiry is how we learned about the secret base on Swan Island, and it's how I learned that ACES had nothing to do with Holt's disappearance, because look how bad of a job they did rescuing a man from a bathtub. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have these big spanking windows, so I'm going to make those today. So Harold Holt's missing at sea, the authorities have been notified. What happens next? Well, it's 1967, so there's one police boat, and it doesn't know where Cheviot Beach is, and the Air Force has one helicopter in Canberra. Right, so they phone up the airport and they say, hey airport, the Prime Minister's missing, we really need to go look for him. Do you guys have a spare helicopter? And they go, yes, we do, but we're in Essendon. It'll take us 2 hours to get there. Not good. So they start cold calling private airstrips around the city, just asking people if they have a helicopter, until a man called Jay Rose picks up, who has a helicopter fueled up and ready to go in, of all places, Moorabbin, which is a lot closer than the airport. So this helicopter becomes the first aerial vehicle involved in the search for Harold Holt. Now, what was it doing in Moorabbin? Jay Rose was on standby because he had a contract to ferry a Moorabbin VIP to an office Christmas party. And that VIP was Santa Claus. The very first helicopter involved in the search for Harold Holt belonged to Santa. And so begins the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Australia. So within 3 hours, there are 4 search and rescue men and 3 Coast Guard divers combing the water. 3 helicopters are involved in the search. By 11 p.m. that night, there's 190 people at the beach involved in the search. By the next day, that number balloons to 350. Now, every report I've read really focuses on the size of the operation, but it's clear that it's not very organized. So as forecast, the evening of Holt's disappearance, a big storm hits, and several rescuers nearly drown, and they need rescuing themselves. There's a second rescue operation within the rescue operation. Now, to give you an idea of how bad conditions were that night, here's something you don't hear about happening very often. Waves nearly sank a helicopter, and fortunately, nobody is hurt.
Mostly. The very next morning, Australians wake up to every single newspaper front page being exactly the same. The Prime Minister of Australia is missing at sea. And all of these newspapers are saying the same thing. There was only one witness, which is a lie, and it is not the first lie that the Commonwealth Police and the government will tell in the fallout after Harold Holt's disappearance. You have no idea how weird this gets. It involves blackmailing the Japanese government. I'm not kidding. Stick around to be continued. I love you. I love you.
My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center doesn't have this octagonal reception area, so I'm going to do that today. Ever since Holt's disappearance, people in his camp bring the same energy to interviews, which is that if something smells fishy to you about this story, there is something wrong with you. So bearing that in mind, the evening that Holt went missing, Commonwealth Police secretly broke into his beach house, stole his briefcase, and then jumped out of the window, all within plain view of Harold Holt's housekeeper, whose name is Tiny Lawless. 1 month later, Commonwealth Police published the results of their investigation. 3 things. 1, Harold Holt was in perfect health. 2, he was deliriously happy. And 3, there is zero mention of Holt's briefcase, because it was never entered into evidence. So lots to unpack. First question, Commonwealth Police. Are they doing a cover-up? The answer is yes, but bit of history first. So what we have today is the Australian Federal Police, and they do investigating and arresting, kind of like a mix of the FBI and also the US Marshal Service. But over in the US, they founded the FBI to deal with crime that crossed state lines, and then they did the whole US Marshals thing because they needed more manpower to catch fugitives. In Australia, we did it in the opposite order. We said no intelligence quite yet, we just want the super cops with universal jurisdiction because someone threw an egg at the Prime Minister's head and he's mad. So at the height of World War I, Prime Minister Billy Hughes is on a speaking tour trying to convince Australia to do conscription. And it's very tense because the year prior, we already had a vote on it, we said no, and it nearly blew up his entire career. Now, rather than accept that Australians don't want to be forced to go do World War I, instead he's blaming the Irish, who have had the audacity to point out that if the British need more soldiers, instead of conscription, why don't they stop occupying our homeland? To which Billy Hughes replies, I'm crazy. So this is the backdrop for Billy Hughes arriving at Warwick train station. Local hero Patrick Brosnan takes a rotten egg, nails him in the head, knocks his hat off. Billy Hughes freaks out, screams, arrest that man. And Queensland Police Senior Sergeant Henry Kenny goes, I was about to don't you gowl. And 1 month later, Billy founds a Commonwealth Police force who, unlike state police, have to do what he says. And then he stations all of them in Queensland to harass the Irish. And so begins a long tradition of the federal government having access to personal attack dogs who are above the law, who can do things like steal Harold Holt's briefcase for you. Not for national security reasons, but because they were under direct orders from Australian Governor-General Lord Casey. Because in the briefcase was a letter from Lord Casey to Harold Holt about a secret feud within the Holt government that was so nasty he was convinced if the press got word of it, it might destroy the coalition. And I'll tell you about the feud next episode. Sorry for the clickbait, and I love you. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still doesn't have this turnstile-y section, and also, look, there's a small wheelie bin. So it's the morning after Harold Holt's disappearance. The search for him is in full swing, but Australia needs a Prime Minister. So who does it automatically fall to? This should be simple. It should just be the Deputy Prime Minister. But it isn't, because the role of Deputy Prime Minister, as of 1967 in Australia, wasn't real. We just pretended it was. It was never enshrined legally in government. Which means that Australia in 1967 is more vulnerable to succession disputes than 10th century England. Now, fortunately, every political party in Australia has a clear line of succession on who takes over if the leader can't fulfill their duties. The one exception to that is the coalition. If the leader of the coalition goes missing, there are 2 separate people that have equal claim to becoming Prime Minister. One is the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, the Treasurer, Billy McMahon, and the other is the quote-unquote Deputy Prime Minister, the leader of the Country Party, John McEwen. But because this is someone that barely anybody voted for, nobody expects them to stay on as the Prime Minister, so they're just a seat warmer until the Liberals can have an election, and then they always elect the Treasurer, because that's always who the next Prime Minister is. And this is what everybody expects to happen. But because the Deputy Prime Ministership isn't legally speaking a real thing, it relies on everybody involved acting on good faith. And you'll never guess what happens next. The leader of the Country Party, John McEwen, a man who was only supposed to be the honorary Prime Minister kinda for a few days while the Liberals sort out their own stuff, he makes an announcement to the press. He announces, if they elect their Treasurer, their Deputy Leader, Billy McMahon, to be the next Prime Minister of Australia, I will not serve under that man. We will quit the coalition, we'll blow the whole thing up. And when the press ask him why, he says, I'm not telling. All this goes down on December 18th. The Liberals set a leadership election for January 9th. So the Liberals give themselves 22 days to make a decision.
Do we call John McEwen's bluff, stand behind our treasurer, and then elect him to be the Prime Minister like everybody expects? Or do we play perfectly into John McEwen's hands and individually turn on one another while our leader is weak and launch a bunch of campaigns to become Prime Minister? Yeah, no, probably a bad look. Anyway, they immediately do that, and then a bunch of them campaign to become Prime Minister at Harold Holt's funeral, the most publicised event in Australian history. This takes a sledgehammer to the credibility of the Liberal Party, and to make matters worse, their leader, the man who everyone was like, that's the next Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, he's completely silent. And so is John McEwen. Still, nobody knows why he's launched this attack until the day of the Liberal Party's election, and he tells the press, the Country Party will not support Billy McMahon as Prime Minister because he is a foreign agent. The Japanese government is paying him for trade secrets. And John McEwen has proof. To be continued. Sorry for the cliffhanger. Yeah. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still needs these picnic benches and this wall of merch. 2 weeks after Harold Holt's disappearance, the caretaker Prime Minister, a man named John McEwen, has just accused the Treasurer of being a paid foreign agent of the Japanese government. Specifically, the claim he's making is that the Treasurer Billy McMahon is leaking secret tariff information to a Canberra press gallery journalist by the name of Maxwell Newton, and that he is then selling those secrets to the Japanese External Trade Organization. And to prove this, he somehow produces a copy of Maxwell Newton's Jetro contract. And the reason that John McEwen has this is because he's not just the Deputy Prime Minister, he's not just the leader of the Country Party, he's the Minister of Trade. And because it's 1968 and Japan is just about to overtake Britain as Australia's largest trading partner, John McEwen is one of the first people to find out that Australian Customs has just raided 3 of the largest Japanese trading companies in Australia and caught them red-handed in a massive conspiracy to dodge import taxes. Now, a normal politician would be worried about sabotaging our relationship with a key trading partner. Not John McEwen. He wants proof that Billy McMahon's dirty. So he pulls the Japanese ambassador into a meeting and he's like, I want Maxwell Newton's contract. I want you to fire Maxwell Newton. Also, I will go to war with you, which is deeply unhinged. Anyway, the Japanese ambassador, who does not work for Jetro, like this is not his department. So he goes away and he comes back with the contract and is like, here you go, please don't blow up diplomacy between our nations. And then John McEwen goes and writes all of this in like a letter to Harold Holt and he starts talking like he's a spy. He's like, oh, he played dumb, but he remembered pretty quickly when I threatened him. And it's like, John, I don't think the Japanese ambassador is lying to you. I just don't think he knows what you're talking about. Because Maxwell Newton, the work that he's doing for Jetro isn't very important. It's not illegal, and it's not even a secret. The only thing that would make it illicit is that if he is getting leaked information from the treasurer, the contract doesn't prove any of that. Anyway, he gets the contract and he writes a letter to Harold Holt and he says, I threatened the Japanese ambassador, went great, got a contract. And when he says it went great, what he means is he turned a 2-person feud into now potentially a feud with the entire nation of Japan. And the best thing about this is that we have the original archived copy of that letter, which is the one that Harold Holt sat down with a pen while he read it for the first time. So we will never know what Harold Holt thought about any of this or what that he planned to do about any of this. But what we do have is a section at the bottom of the letter titled Side Observation 2 p.m. and it starts, this could be so big, dude. We could drag this out. The government could fully go for like an out-of-court thing. We could like fully leverage this situation. And you can feel what Holt is thinking because he doesn't underline or circle any of the accusations. He's just tiredly underlined the word government because that's who John McEwen has dragged into this ridiculous feud. And I don't know how to explain this to you, but John McEwen is the good guy in this story. Yeah. I love you. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre is currently lacking these tubes. So we're going to do this whole roof section today because that is the spirit of Tubemas. Merry Tubemas, everybody. If Harold Holt had never gone missing in the ocean, it's likely the thing that we'd remember him for is the feud between his 2 most senior right-hand men, the Deputy PM and the Treasurer. And if you've been following this series, you'd know that the Deputy PM, right before Harold Holt went missing, blackmailed the Japanese government just to maybe get some dirt on the Treasurer. Go back and listen to the previous episodes. Happy 20th episode, by the way. I love you. All right, let's talk about the origin of this feud. Who started it? Who's the bad guy and who's the good guy? And I'm saying this with full knowledge that a journalist would hear that and be like, oh, that's very immature. Things aren't that black and white and simple in real life. Well, this time it was. Let me tell you about Deputy Prime Minister John McEwen. This is a man who was orphaned at age 7. He dropped out of school when he was 13 years old. Then, when World War I broke out, He got accepted into officer school at Duntroon. And then instead of going, he enlisted in the army as a private so that he could get to World War I earlier. And then when he got back, the soldier settler scheme gave him a plot of land so that he could start a farm. And just like many other returned soldiers who were given these plots of land to work, John McEwen wasn't a farmer. None of these guys knew what they were doing, and they didn't have much support beyond here's the land, go and make some money with it. So most of these farms failed, and some of them seriously damaged the local ecology and the topsoil. And a great example of that barely anybody knows about is at Wilson's Promontory, which is a national park 3-hour drive out of Melbourne. There is a place there called the Big Drift, and it is a 5 square kilometer man-made desert caused by settler soldiers planting sweet potatoes that didn't have the root base to stop the wind from just blowing all the soil into the ocean, and now nothing can ever grow there. And if you're not from here, you might be thinking, oh, a desert in Australia, big deal. Like, no, this is what Wilson's Prom looks like. It's basically a rainforest. And there's a desert there. Anyway, all of that to say, settler soldiers were not good at farming. Not John McEwen. He worked his ass off. His farm flourished, and he became one of the most respected farmers in the entire state. And only after achieving all of that did he wend his way into politics, where he got a reputation for always frowning. For fun, he would drink 20 cups of black tea per day. He was married to the same woman for 50 years. He was the longest-serving politician in the entire Holt government, including Harold Holt himself. He is the leader of the Country Party, and for all of those reasons, he's the man that they call John Blackjack McEwen. Except for Robert Menzies, who would call him Jean Lenoir, which is extremely cute. John McEwen is the conservative politician that conservative politicians love to pretend to be, which is why this feud isn't about any sort of personal past grievance between the two men. This is about the fact that John McEwen knows what Billy McMahon is, and that is, quote, a totally amoral, conspiratorial, devious, untrustworthy, disloyal, petty, cowardly, treacherous bastard who lies all the time, steals things, is a contemptible little squirt, and one time he milked a horse with his mouth. And if all of that makes John McEwen sound petty, I wasn't quoting him. I was quoting all of Billy McMahon's closest colleagues and friends, and 2 of his biographers. Except for the milking a horse with his mouth thing, that's just a story that he told about himself. So yeah, stick around if you want to hear about that guy, because it gets weirder. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center is a house of lies. So after my last video, I got a message from a PhD student who's researching the colonial history of national parks, and they said, oh, I'd never heard about the Big Drift in Wilson's Prom being man-made before. Can you send me your source for that? So I went online and I started researching the origins of the Big Drift, and it took me 9 hours to get a straight answer. The story of the Big Drift starts with a man named Baron von Mueller, a botanist and the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, starting in 1853. In the 1860s, farmers in southwest Victoria contacted von Mueller asking for help with a problem because sandy areas adjacent to their farms were growing and it was threatening to consume their pasture land where they fed their livestock. So von Mueller replies, it's an easy fix, build a fence, keep your livestock out of the sandy areas, and let the local vegetation grow back. And then for fun, you can introduce some invasive European plants, but the main thing is to build a fence, and the farmers said, cool, we're not going to do that. Fast forward to 1918, and a bunch of graziers in Yanaki, which is right where the Big Drift is next to Wilson's Prom, they had a meeting because they needed to fence off some of their pasture land to avoid sand drift spreading and consuming all of their properties. And the farmers said, well, we could fence it off, but then we wouldn't make money. So they didn't. So the sand drift problem worsens until 1935 when the Victorian government springs into action and spends £15,000 not on livestock fencing, on invasive marram grass seeds, and gets a bunch of Depression-era labourers to go and plant them, including at places like Yanaki, which is right where the Big Drift is. Remember how in the 1860s we knew that overgrazing sandy areas caused irreversible sand drift? Well, it turns out if you abandon your farm entirely, that is 100 times worse, which is what basically every farmer in Wimmera and Mallee were forced to do in northwest Victoria, because not only was there the drought of 1939, World War II kicked off and there was no international market for any of their goods. That led to 2 spiraling feedback loops. One was that the sand drift would clog up irrigation ditches, making it extremely difficult to feed cattle, and the other was that farmers became more dependent on forest and bush grazing until these areas became deforested, causing more sand drift, causing more irrigation problems, till it got so bad that in 1946 the Victorian state government launched a royal commission into illegal forest grazing. To summarize this report, it says that erosion is inevitable and will kill us all. Farmers are massively accelerating the rate of erosion, and they cannot be trusted to fix it on their own. And the most destructive farming practice that they identify is forest grazing. In this case, the state government leasing out crown land to graziers so that they can send their cows in and eat all of the greenery. And the problem is that once that land is leased, there is absolutely no oversight. These graziers can bring in as much livestock as they want, which exposes the soil, causes more sand drift, makes feed harder to grow, and every time we tried to put limits on this practice, farmers have done it illegally anyway. The report ends by recommending the creation of a soil conservation authority, which we don't do. And then in 1949, I found this picture of cattle ranchers at Yanaki running all of their livestock straight into Wilson's Prom through the Big Drift. So to conclude, the Big Drift was caused by beef, wool, dairy, and grease. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center needs this wall with 5 bins against it. Which bin are you? I'm red bin. Or maybe I'm blue bin. It's time to do my favorite thing again, which is say really mean things about William McMahon. But to be fair to him, let's start with something nice. So in 1971, after he's done being Harold Holt's treasurer, after he's finished being politically assassinated by John McEwen, William McMahon does achieve his life's dream and become Australian Prime Minister. And in 2004, The Age conducted a survey of 8 historians and got them to rank every Prime Minister we've ever had in order from best to worst. So I'd like to say congratulations, William McMahon, for surprising me, because out of the 8 historians, only 7 of them ranked him dead last, which is better than I expected, to be honest. So why is McMahon so universally disliked? Well, let's start from the start. McMahon was born filthy rich because his grandfather was an evil Dickensian landlord, notorious for putting his workers in the hospital. McMahon's dad inherited the family business, didn't treat the workers much better, and because of his drinking and gambling, William McMahon was raised by his uncle, the Lord Mayor of Sydney. And so William McMahon was educated at a series of elite private schools, and despite this, he still managed to fail his HSCs. Then when he turned 18, his father passed away. He inherited buckets of money, which he spent on racehorses and also gambling on racehorses, which he loved so much that one time one of his friends was like, "I'm about to be arrested. Here's £1,000. Hang on to it and bail me out of jail in the morning." McMahon said, "Okay," and then stole that money and gambled with it. After that, he scraped his way through a Bachelor of Laws, and despite being a terrible student, became an articled clerk at one of Sydney's top law firms, and once he became a solicitor there, they made him partner 2 weeks later. Then when World War II broke out, he avoided enlisting for as long as he could and later lied about serving in the Navy. He then found his way into politics after winning Liberal pre-selection in an electorate he'd never lived in because he had a personal written reference from, of all people, former Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes. Once he became an MP, he got a reputation for lying constantly, including lying repeatedly about the date that his mother passed away for some reason. He would also constantly fabricate statistics in Parliament and then get his staff to tamper with the Hansard to make him correct and then hand out a doctored transcript to press gallery journalists who were too lazy to double-check his numbers and would just print them, which is a scam that he got away with for decades. Whenever anyone challenged him on any of this, he would bring up his honours degree in economics, which was also a lie. He was also half-deaf, which is fine, but he was too vain to ever wear a hearing aid, which would be fine if he wasn't a compulsive, duplicitous gossip, constantly getting caught saying awful things behind his colleagues' backs because he didn't have an inside voice. I think the only thing that he ever told the truth about was that one time he milked a horse with his mouth, which I've brought up before, but I think bears repeating. He milked a horse with his mouth. Anyway, if you're wondering why the Liberal Party kept him around so long, that's a great question. Stick around, I'm going to answer that because it gets even weirder. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs all these plastic chairs that are not like the other plastic chairs, and also this wheelie bin full of program noodles. Quick recap, we're talking about William McMahon, who was the treasurer under Harold Holt. He was the absolute worst. Nobody liked him. He had no friends. And when he was 12 years old, he milked a horse with his mouth. So you're all caught up. So why did the Liberal Party not get rid of William McMahon? Because he wasn't just unpopular, he was radioactive. Like, not only does Malcolm Fraser, who is one of the Liberal Party's most conservative MPs, hate William McMahon, but so does the left wing. Like, Gough Whitlam called William McMahon a stinky little girl in Parliament. Even his wife, Sonia McMahon, did not like him. She said no to half a dozen marriage proposals from him until someone pointed out to her that she could be the First Lady of Australia if he became Prime Minister. And she was like, okay, I'll marry him now. And then we will give birth to Julian McMahon and he will play Cole in Charmed. Sorry, we're going off on a lot of tangents today, but if you've ever wondered how William McMahon felt about being so disrespected by literally everybody that he worked with, he thought everyone was jealous. He thought they were all jealous of how smart he was and how hardworking he was. He thought they were all threatened by his greatness, which absolutely not the case, unless by greatness you mean the greatness with which he dressed, and that made people call him gay, which we're not going to get into. So from 1949 until 1966, conservative politics was run by Robert Menzies. And if you don't know already, he looks like a Muppet. It's just an amazing head on this man. So Robert Menzies knew that he could not trust William McMahon, but he kept him around because in 1959, Menzies caught William McMahon leaking secrets from cabinet, which is a sackable offense, but he didn't sack him. Instead, he drags McMahon into his office and he goes, "Did you leak secrets from cabinet?" And McMahon goes, kinda. And Menzies goes, "No, I want a straight answer." And he brings in his secretary and he's like, She's going to write down every single word that you say, and then we're both going to sign that confession, and I'm going to put it in an envelope, and I'm going to put it in a safe. And this sword of Damocles is going to dangle over your head for the rest of your career. And if you cross me again, I will destroy you. And McMahon goes, okay, can I please have a pencil? I want to make some amendments to the confession. And if you are curious what that looks like, here it is. It's beautiful, it's perfect, but Menzies made a mistake. Because when he retired in 1966, he handed the keys to the Liberal Party to the new Prime Minister, Harold Holt, but he didn't give him the letter. And we don't know if this is because Menzies was old and sick and tired, or because Harold Holt didn't want to be the next Menzies. He was determined to be an urbane leader that people wanted to follow, rather than big, scary Sam Eagle. Whatever it was, as soon as Menzies was out of the picture in 1966, William McMahon started work on destroying Harold Holt. And we're going to talk about how deep this goes and what it has to do with Ronald Reagan. Next episode, stick around. It gets weirder. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still doesn't have this abstract beach installation, which I've been putting off making because there's no straight lines. And I don't know who these are meant to be. Who's that? Okay, so why do I think that if Harold Holt had never gone missing, Ronald Reagan never would have been elected? To answer that, I need to explain how William McMahon, Harold Holt's treasurer, rose to power. So in 1932, McMahon was 24 years old, and he had just become an articled clerk at the law firm now known as Allen's. And in October of that year, McMahon received a tip that a client of Allen's was desperate for investors for an extremely lucrative investment opportunity, which was completely legitimate. Anyway, so the scam was that journalist George Warneck was at Allen's getting papers drafted up to acquire an unprofitable Sydney-based newspaper. But Warneck isn't looking for investors to make this newspaper profitable. He's looking for investors to pretend like they're going to make it profitable to scare one of their competitors into buying them out. And in particular, they're hoping to scare this man, Hugh Dennison, the chairman of Associated Newspapers Limited, which is a company that should not be abbreviated. Now, here's the scammy part. In today's money, George Warneck is able to get together $3.5 million. But then because he's a senior journalist, he knows how to lie and get a bunch of newspapers to claim that he has raised $18 million, which works exactly as intended. Anal Panics buys them out for $10 million, overnight tripling their investment, which is not a real investment. But that's not even close to being the dodgiest bit, because the reason that George Warneck is so confident that Hugh Dennison is going to buy them out is because one of his key investors is a man named Frank Packer, and the Packers are an Australian media dynasty. They own everything, including managing editor of Associated Newspapers Limited. The man responsible for handing over $10 million of Anal's money to Frank Packer and William McMahon is R.C. Packer, Frank Packer's dad, and he did it behind Hugh Dennison's back. Anyway, the scam is so profitable that Frank Packer is able to go on and be Frank Packer. William McMahon goes from being a rich Nepo baby to an extremely wealthy man. But more importantly, remember how William McMahon's a bit deaf? So is Frank Packer, and they become friends over it. So remember how everybody hates McMahon? He doesn't need friends because he's got a co-conspirator. He leaks everything that he hears to Frank Packer in exchange for immaculate media coverage. And I promise I didn't mean to do this, but I have to do the Reagan connection next episode. But 35 years later, because of this scam, William McMahon is treasurer, and he is one Harold Holt away from achieving his life's goal of becoming Prime Minister of Australia. But if you've been following this series, you know he is thwarted by your friend and mine, John Blackjack McEwen, who accuses him of leaking secrets to the Japanese government. What I didn't tell you then is that the newspaper that breaks this story and puts it on their front page nationally is The Australian, which belongs to new kid on the block, Rupert Murdoch. And the reason Murdoch supports McEwen is because at this point in time, they're both protectionists. They staunchly oppose deregulated free markets. But not for long. Murdoch is about to convert towards neoliberalism, and he's going to do it because Harold Holt disappeared. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs this nifty hoop and pole combination that, frankly, I'm pretty excited about. All right, let me explain. If Harold Holt had never gone missing, he would be remembered for the war between his two right-hand men, Treasurer Billy McMahon and Deputy PM John Blackjack McEwen. And if you're new here, we don't like Billy McMahon because he was delusionally conceited. It's easy then to assume that McEwen hated McMahon for the same reasons that everyone did. He was the worst. And he was, but that's not the complete picture. See, John McEwen is Minister for Trade, and his loyalty is to farmers, primary industries. And the way he wants to protect them is by introducing tariffs so that imports aren't competing with our exports. Billy McMahon, on the other hand, is a rich kid from Sydney with a degree in economics. He is obsessed with free trade. But this is before Thatcher and Reagan united conservative politics around the idea of free trade. And so in Australia, Melbourne conservatives love tariffs, Sydney conservatives love free trade. And it's this historical divide that is key to understanding why Rupert Murdoch, prior to the 1980s, supported the Labor Party and supported tariffs and supported taxes, because he was conservative, but Murdoch was staunchly within John McEwen's protectionist camp. And I say staunchly because in 1964, when Rupert Murdoch founded the newspaper The Australian, his founding editor was Maxwell Newton, a press gallery journalist, best friends with Treasurer Billy McMahon, and an outspoken critic of John McEwen's protectionist policies. So much so that 8 short months after he's hired, Rupert Murdoch sacks him because he won't stop writing pro-free trade editorials. Newton then does the 60s equivalent of starting a bunch of really successful economics podcasts and substacks, which are extremely influential not just because he's a great writer, but because he's being leaked secrets by the Treasurer of Australia because they have a shared enemy in arch-protectionist John Blackjack McEwen. All of this should have destroyed the coalition. No one's more aware of that than Harold Holt, and he is able to just barely hold things together. But then he goes for a swim at Cheviot Beach. John McEwen becomes caretaker prime minister, and in his first act, he gets the Commonwealth Police to raid Billy McMahon's house, looking for more evidence he's been leaking secrets to the press. In response, Maxwell Newton triples down on attacking John McEwen in the press, which he's so good at. He's a big part of the reason John McEwen goes from being one of the most respected men in conservative politics to a faded, irrelevant old man. It's unclear how big of a role Newton played in this, but to him, he's the main character. He goes mad with power and starts indiscriminately leaking government secrets until he pushes it too far and leaks a diplomatic cable between France and Australia, the contents of which aren't important, but the audacity prompts the government to do their favorite thing, which is to get the Commonwealth Police to illegally raid Maxwell Newton's house. This is what, according to Maxwell Newton's daughter, breaks him. He goes from being an eccentric but still highly respected economic analyst into a degenerate Quaalude addict, a pornography salesman, a brothel landlord, and then by 1977, he is destitute. It is at this point that something inexplicable happens. Newton receives a phone call from his former employer, Rupert Murdoch, who says, "Yeah, you've barely been a journalist for 10 years and you're famously addicted to hard drugs. I'm going to fly you out to New York City and instate you..." Stick around, it gets weirder. New York Post. Do you see where this is going? Do you see what's about to happen? To be continued. I'm sorry. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs this trestle table with 9 yellows under it. So let's make that now. Happy New Year, I'm back. Let's finish talking about this image that I will forever regret creating. There are a lot of characters in this story so far, so here's a recap if you're just joining us. Harold Holt is the Prime Minister in charge of the Conservative coalition that ran the Australian government from 1948 until 1972. The coalition that he inherits when he becomes Prime Minister in 1966 is extremely popular in Australia, but internally, secretly, is completely disunited. And the key issue that is dividing the coalition into two rough groups is protectionism. Do we want lots of tariffs, or do we want lots of free trade and foreign investment? On the free trader side, you have the villains. You have the Treasurer and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, Billy Big Ears McMahon. You also have Frank Packer, the owner of the Daily Telegraph and Channel 9, and their dirty little errand boy, Canberra Press Gallery journalist Maxwell Newton. More on him later. On the other side, in the protectionist camp, you have our friend John Blackjack McEwen, the leader of the Country Party, the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. You also have Rupert Murdoch of Rupert Murdoch fame. Which side is Harold Holt on? Who knows? It's a mystery. The only thing that Holt really consistently does throughout this story, go back and watch the previous 25 episodes if you want to catch up, is flip-flop and make things worse by being indecisive. But we do have to give him a little bit of credit because at least when he was alive, all of the infighting within the coalition between John Blackjack McEwen and Billy Big Ears McMahon, who milked a horse with his mouth one time, the worst of it was swept under the rug. As soon as Holt was gone, all of the fighting tumbled out into the streets. And the big winner of this big fight is, at least temporarily, dirty little errand boy, Canberra Press Gallery journalist Maxwell Newton. And the way that he profits off of this situation is, while Harold Holt is alive, he has a calming influence. He keeps all of the beef under wraps. As soon as Holt is gone, John Blackjack McEwen is off the leash, and he gets so mad at Maxwell Newton, he turns him from a prominent critic of the Country Party to a national celebrity. And so it's because of Harold Holt's disappearance that Maxwell Newton has the profile necessary to get the attention of Rupert Murdoch and get himself flown out to go and become the financial editor of the New York Post, which is a publication that is so politically influential, at least in the state of New York, that according to New York Magazine, the Reagan campaign personally credits the New York Post with winning the state of New York for Ronald Reagan. And as their reward, in 1987, the Fairness Doctrine is repealed, which frees up Rupert Murdoch to build the Fox News empire. And if you're hearing that and you're like, okay, there is no way that a random Australian that I have never heard of influenced a US presidential election on that scale. That's fair enough, because there were other really influential economists like Carl Brunner and Milton Friedman who were laying the groundwork for Reaganomics a full decade before Maxwell Newton ever got involved in US politics. Yeah, you're probably right. Maxwell Newton's not an influential figure. Anyway, here's Carl Brunner and Milton Friedman publicly fanboying for Maxwell Newton, acknowledging his massive contributions to spreading their ideas and selling them to the American public. And if you want to know why we don't talk about Maxwell Newton, strap in, it gets extremely weird. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs this classic food court table setup. No one here is having fun. Everyone's getting sunburnt. So we got to make that today. Margarine. What is that? And what's it made of? I'm so glad that you asked, because the answer to that changes depending on the year that it is in Australia. For example, when I say margarine, what you're picturing is a vegetarian substitute for butter made primarily from seed oils. But the further back in time you go, the more animal fat there is in the margarine. And in 1967, the year that Harold Holt drowned, the most common spread on Australian dinner tables was 90% beef tallow, which is, among many other things, yucky. So why were we doing that? We did it because according to state law, any margarine containing 11% or more seed oil content was table margarine, and table margarine was illegal to sell without a license in Australia. So why was margarine at this time a controlled substance? The long answer is, hello, I'm the dairy industry. Margarine wants all of us to die. The short answer is, hi, I'm everybody else. The dairy lobby is made up of greedy, disgusting pigs, and their profits are more important than poor people having access to affordable dairy alternatives, including during the Great Depression when the dairy lobby banned cocoa butter, and including during World War II when the dairy lobby introduced strict margarine production quotas. This leaves us with two really interesting questions. The first is, why were we spreading animal fat on our toast? And secondly, how did we get the margarine industry deregulated? I'm going to answer most of that right now, but hit that follow button. And if you would like to support my work, here is a link to give me money. And if you would not like to give me money, that's okay too. I'm just happy that you're here. I love you. Here's a picture of my cat. So the reason for all the animal fat is that since its invention in 1869, margarine has never had a specific formulation. All it is an emulsion of fats and oils, typically the cheapest available, and for a long time, that was animal fat. And because it wasn't very good on toast, this initial variety of margarine is called cooking margarine. But then seed oil processing technology enters the game, and suddenly you don't have to de-stinkify whale blubber to make a stick of margarine, and now it's more spreadable. You can put it on bread, you can serve it at the table. Table margarine. So when the dairy lobby introduces margarine quotas, all they care about is table margarine. Cooking margarine remains unregulated. And this is their critical mistake because they underestimate one of the most Australian things that Australians love to do more than anything else in the world, which is have a little trick that saves money at the checkout. People notice that there's not really that much of a difference between cooking margarine and table margarine, especially if you mix in your own ingredients at home, which the government can't stop you from doing. So this trend of using cooking margarine as butter spreads from working class households to the rest of Australia, and eventually the margarine industry gets in on it, and they're like, hey guys, we can't tell you to spread this on your toast, but we can't stop you if you tried. Ain't no law says a dog can't give himself heart disease. And it's this adoption of cooking margarine as a butter substitute that gives the margarine industry enough strength, enough money to take the fight back to dairymen, which is what they do in 1966. While Harold Holt is Prime Minister, they launch the Butter War. And I am so excited to get to tell you this. The Butter War is the reason John Blackjack McEwen hates Billy McMahon. To be continued. It's just too good. It starts with Robert Menzies, founder of the Liberal Party, longest-serving Prime Minister in Australian history, Blue-Green 1-1 with Trample, great commander for a Simic ramp deck, rose to power stoking fears about communist invasion. He didn't actually say that quote. But what if he did? But then he retired and was replaced by his treasurer, the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, your friend and mine, Harold Holt, mono blue, completely and utterly useless. And I am not saying here that the Harold Holt card exiles itself. What I am saying is if you do play this card and it does exile itself, you're not going to get a lot of sympathy if you flip the table and say, what an unforeseeable tragedy. Let's respect his memory by not having any formal investigation into how this happened. His favorite song would be the party rock anthem by LMFAO, and he did say that quote. Those were his last words. Under Holt's lack of leadership, the Conservative coalition fractured into two camps based on whether or not we should do free trade or regulate the economy to protect domestic production. Leader of the free trade camp is Billy Big Ears McMahon. He did not say that quote, but it is true. He's a lying, cheating, stealing little freak with a weird history with horses. If you know, you know. And his favorite song is Firework by Katy Perry and also Chandelier by Sia. He thinks that they're the same song. He doesn't know that it's two separate songs. Everybody hates McMahon except for a few gremlins in the press, such as Maxwell Newton, Newton is weirdly a key player in Ronald Reagan's rise to power. He didn't say that quote, but again, it did happen. He's a weird libertarian freak who campaigned to decriminalize tax evasion and then fled Australia with a with a tax debt in the multiple tens of millions, which he got away with. He never paid it back. Most of what I know about him comes from a biography written by his daughter, who I have included here solely so you can see how much she looks exactly like Jane Lynch. Oh, and Maxwell Newton's favorite song is I Love It by Charlie XCX. He doesn't know any of the words. He also doesn't know who Charlie XCX is. He calls it the KFC song. On the protectionist side, you have the leader of the country party, the minor party in the coalition. He's the deputy prime minister. He's the minister for trade. He oversaw Japan overtaking the UK as Australia's top trading partner. When he was 80 years old and sick in hospital, he just woke up one day and said, I'm not eating anymore. And that's how he died. And as for that quote, he did say that to Billy McMahon in an argument about margarine quotas. His favorite song is the entirety of Harvest Moon by Neil Young, the whole album, and You Can't Talk. Everybody loves McEwen, but his policies are decreasingly popular. The only real support he has is from media baron Rupert Murdoch, which is, this is just Emrakul. I don't think Murdoch listens to music, but I do think that in his head constantly, One-Winged Angel, Sephiroth's theme from Final Fantasy VII is playing over and over again, even when he's eating breakfast. After Holt disappears, there's a leadership dispute, but because McEwen's +1/-1 effect completely wipes out McMahon's 0-1 stat line, McMahon's bid for leadership is vetoed, and the Liberals are sent into such a scramble that they end up making a senator prime minister, which has never happened before or since. I don't quite know what the Senate does, so he is colourless and he has banding, because just like the Senate, I don't quite know what banding does. Who's he banding with? No one knows. Anyway, that's part 1 of 2. If you want to hear John Gorton's favorite song, stick around. I love you. This is John Gorton, and he's kind of the reason we have universal healthcare in Australia. 2 things you need to know about him. Firstly, he was the Prime Minister from 1968 till 1971. But more importantly, John Gorton had a theme song, and that song is My Way by Frank Sinatra. And let me be clear about this. This is not a campaign song. That would be a normal thing for a politician to have and to play at campaign rallies while campaigning for office. But John Gorton never campaigned. He became Prime Minister after an emergency internal Liberal Party election in the immediate wake of Harold Holt's drowning. Now, John Gorton didn't select this theme song for himself. That would be a bit too insane. It was thrust upon him by an anonymous editor at the ABC, but it's a testament to how much of a loose unit he was that everybody since then, including this obituary writer, thought that he himself, like Batman, needed theme music. And this loose unitivity is John Gorton in a nutshell. He drank and flirted with single women in office so publicly that people started referring to hangovers as a case of the Gorton flu. Like, he was a war hero, he was a fighter pilot in World War II, but the way that he got wounded is the most Aussie thing that's ever happened. So the aircraft carrier he's on gets attacked, he survives that. He gets into a dogfight, he survives that, but his engine fails. He makes an emergency landing, survives that, and then accidentally flips his plane upside down and would have been fine if he'd been wearing his seatbelt like he should have, which is why he looks the way that he looks, because he boinked his face into the windshield of his plane and broke all the bones in his face. Like, I exclusively refer to William McMahon as Billy Big Ears, and that's a John Gorton quote. He came up with that. John Gorton is the maverick politician that conservative politicians like to pretend they are. Eventually, he loses control of the coalition, and he suspects that there is a leadership spill coming his way. He calls his senior ministers into a meeting and goes around the room one by one, looking these men in the eye and goes, "Are you going to challenge me for leadership?" Until he gets to Billy Big Ears McMahon, the slimiest little snake worm that there ever was. And he says, absolutely not. And then he goes to John McEwen's house and begs him permission. Please, can you lift the veto so that I can be the Prime Minister of Australia? And McEwen says, sure, I'm retiring anyway. McMahon becomes Prime Minister. John Gorton, purely out of spite, puts his hand up and says, I would like to be Deputy Leader. And everyone votes him in as Deputy Leader, and he dedicates the rest of his career to bullying and undermining William McMahon, making his ministry so hilariously ineffective that Gough Whitlam, Labour leader, is able to smash the next election and then institute, among many other things, free healthcare for all Australians. And there is absolutely no way that the Labour Party could have overtaken the Liberals and the Country Party in popularity in Australia in the 70s if it wasn't for the sabotage and the pettiness of John Gorton. And yes, Gough Whitlam is just Ulamog because he looks really impressive, but he's useless against blue. Anyway, now you're all caught up. You can watch the rest of the series. I love you. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre is still missing this key feature. It's the one and only black square and witch's hat. In 1968, a few short weeks after Harold Holt drowned, the Treasurer of Australia walked into the Prime Minister's office and handed him the funniest document in the history of Australian politics. The document is titled Short History of Difficulties with Mr. McEwen, and it is 12 pages long. Let's focus on the first incident. So January of 1956, Billy McMahon, Sydney-based Nepo baby, despite knowing nothing about agriculture, is somehow the Minister for Primary Industry. And John McEwen, leader of the Country Party, whose core base is entirely farmers, is watching him like a hawk. So when McMahon makes a cabinet submission about the dairy industry without consulting McEwen first, McEwen bails him up in the hallway and says this: "If you go on with this submission, I will fucking murder you. I am butter." So why is Blackjack so angry? It has to do with this cow and the Australian Butter War. And if you don't know what that is, go to my profile, watch this episode. In 1940, Australian dairymen successfully lobbied for laws restricting the production of margarine. And because they couldn't admit that margarine is just a cheaper, superior product that doesn't turn to stone when it gets cold, they pretended to care about the fact that some margarine was made with imported seed oils from Papua New Guinea, where sweatshop labor was common. But in 1955, a margarine manufacturer, whose name was Dick Crebin, called them on their bluff. He set a trap by blatantly exceeding margarine production quotas by making margarine out of 100% Aussie ingredients, which, if the dairy lobby had been telling the truth, shouldn't be an issue. Of course, they were lying, so they immediately drag him into court, kicking off a 10-year-long legal battle. Despite the fact that Crebin's margarine is made from 100% Aussie ingredients, and also it is being produced specifically for sale in other states, and interstate trade is explicitly protected from government interference by the Australian Constitution. Despite both of these things, the High Court of Australia rules in favour of the dairy lobby upholding margarine quotas, which pisses Crebin off. So Crebin hires the most influential ad agency on the planet, McCann Erickson, and they launch the Mrs. Jones campaign. The premise is so simple and so unhinged. Mrs. Jones is an average Aussie mum. She chooses to buy margarine, but the government won't let her. So much for Australia being a free country. Buy margarine, unless you hate Australia. Now, because Australia is the way that it is, Mrs. Jones is a smash hit. And the dairy lobby make matters worse, because they come up with their own mascot, and it's a cow. Oh, you care about Mrs. Jones? What about this lady? That's not a lady, that is a cow. But the reason this cow is in the newspaper is because in 1956, Billy McMahon made a cabinet submission suggesting that the dairy lobby should be able to pilfer the Dairy Industry Stabilization Fund and piss that money away on ads. That is money that was meant to support marginal producers, family-owned farms that were going bankrupt. When Blackjack McEwen threatened to kill a member of parliament, it's because he saw what was coming, which was a collapse of independent family-owned farms, monopolies in agriculture, and price gouging at the supermarket. But he tried to stop it. I salute you for your efforts, John McEwen. You were butter. Anyway, stick around for more. It gets even weirder. My replica of the Holt Swim Center still needs this staircase, which is going to be a nightmare, but I have to do it because these stairs lead to a fitness center that is run by a guy who watches this show. Massive shout out to all the Harold Holt Pool employees who have been supporting this show since weirdly early on. I love you. I hope I don't get you fired. In 1966, hostilities in the Australian butter margarine war are at their peak. On one side, you have a margarine manufacturer whose name is Dick Crebin and his wildly successful pro-margarine mascot, Mrs. Jones. And on the other side, you have the butter producers of Australia, backed by the government, who have regulated margarine production into oblivion. But just 8 months after the Mrs. Jones campaign launched, this is the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And then the very next day, the New South Wales government backflips and upholds the quotas. 160 margarine factory workers are laid off overnight. This puts Dick Crebin in a difficult position because the Mrs. Jones PR campaign is wildly successful at winning over the hearts and minds of the public, but this isn't translating to public policy. So at the start of 1967, the CEO of McCann Erickson, who's in charge of the Mrs. Jones campaign, says, I want to bring in some fresh talent. What we need is somebody who does not work for McCann Erickson. We need somebody who does not work in advertising, full stop. We need someone who is a drinking buddy of mine I've known since I was a teenager. What we need is a seedy, amoral, drug-addicted, alcoholic journalist. We need Maxwell Newton. Now, if you've been following this series, you know exactly who that is and what is about to happen. Because remember, it's the start of 1967. So Maxwell Newton rocks up and he says, so there are legal limits on how much table margarine we can sell. But there are no limits on how much cooking margarine we can sell because it's 90% beef tallow and no one in their right mind would ever think it's a butter substitute. Here's my pitch. Let's lie and say disgusting cooking margarine is just as good as table margarine for spreading on toast. Now, if we were to do that, on the one hand, that would be illegal. But on the other hand, who cares? And so in 1967, Mrs. Jones pivoted from saying margarine production quota laws are a bit outdated to a campaign telling people the government doesn't want you spreading animal fat on your toast. Are you a coward? Are you a goody two-shoes coward? Which is so successful that margarine sales cut so hard into butter sales that it draws the attention of the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia himself, John Blackjack McEwen, who is so angry about it that he turns around several weeks later, blackmails the Japanese ambassador to Australia, specifically looking for dirt on Maxwell Newton. because Blackjack McEwen is a hardcore protectionist and Mrs. Jones and Maxwell Newton are hardcore libertarian free trade advocates. And it's this second phase of the Mrs. Jones campaign and this widespread adoption of cooking margarine as a butter substitute that signals the end of protectionism and of Blackjack's career in politics. Because Mrs. Jones doesn't just make margarine production quotas unpopular, it made them obsolete. And by the time they were officially abolished by the Whitlam government in 1975, it had been years since state governments had really bothered to enforce them. Anyway, that's the story of the Australian Butter War, and it's how we legalized margarine. And if you would like to know what any of this has to do with Harold Holt, please stick around because we are going to get back to basics. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have an outdoor pool, which, now that I think about it, does seem important, so I'd better do that now. In 1920, Harold Holt is 12 years old, he moves to Melbourne and enrolls at Wesley College, and he decides, I need a nickname. He goes with Tiger. The nickname does not stick because all the Wesley boys start calling him something else. They call him Harry Puss, and this nickname does stick for the rest of his life. I wish I was making it up. Obviously, that doesn't have the same meaning in the 20s as it does today, but you can still tell, despite Harold Holt's biographer's best attempts to kind of polish the turd, Holt was clearly a loser. He only had 3 friends, and they also had really unfortunate names. First, there was John Cumpston. Then there was Johnny Bust, and lastly, Spot Turnbull, which doesn't sound bad, but he was only called Spot because he had a massive birthmark right between his eyebrows. So Spot, Cumpston, Bust, and Puss Holt are top of their class, which gets the attention of Wesley's schoolmaster, whose name is Lawrence Adamson. Let me tell you a couple things about this guy. So he becomes schoolmaster in 1902, and he doesn't do it by being qualified, he does it by buying the school. And as a testament to how much he should never have been in charge of any institution anywhere on the planet, the first thing that he does is establish a dog cemetery. Because Adamson never married, but he did have a lot of dogs, and every time one of them died, all the boys at Wesley had to have a dog funeral with him. Far and away, the best thing about Lawrence Adamson is that he had a long-running feud with the magician Harry Houdini, because Houdini announced an Australian tour and he said, while I'm there, I'm going to become the first person to fly a plane in Australia. Now, despite the fact that Adamson was British and only immigrated to Australia as an adult, specifically for medical reasons, he didn't want a foreigner being the first person to fly a plane here. So in 1909, Adamson and a bunch of other very early aircraft enthusiasts took a bunch of planes out into the bush and then failed miserably to beat Houdini to the punch. It's a miracle none of them died. And then you've got Harold Holt's sporting achievements. Now, you got to remember, if you're an official biographer of an Aussie Prime Minister, you have to paint a flattering portrait. But by trying to polish the turd, they just draw attention to it. I'll show you what I mean. For example, Holt used to go swimming a lot. And clearly he was so bad at it that the only thing we can credit him for is that he was alive while he did it. As for team sports, we can't say that he was clumsy and slow, so we'll say that he was sturdy and robust. On the footy team, he was a full-back, which isn't always a dud position, but in Holt's case it was, because they praise him for the fact that his elbows would flail so wildly, opposing players were scared to go near him, followed by praise that is such a reach, this biographer has to invent a word. Holt was an asset because of his there-ness. He was there. And to top it off, he was the first batsman in the history of the Wesley cricket team to ever get run out in 2 innings in the same match, which I had to look this up. That is a feat so wildly embarrassing and incompetent. In 130 years of protest cricket history, it's only happened 26 times. And they still made him captain of the cricket team. Anyway, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Stick around if you want to hear more about the unearned success of Harold Holt, the man, the myth, the pool. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have these windows that look like a quick copy-paste job, but they're not. They're all very slightly different. Just like everything else in this pool, we're going to have to do this the hard way. When Harold Holt became Prime Minister in 1966, he said to his wife Zara, "I'm so proud of myself for achieving this without stepping over any dead bodies." Now, this is tough for me to admit, but he was telling the truth when he said this. Harold Holt didn't stab anybody in the back. He didn't play any dirty tricks to become the Prime Minister. So at the risk of maybe detracting from that, here is a list of all the literal dead bodies that Harold Holt had to step over to become Prime Minister. It's more than you would think. Kicking off with dead body number 1, it's George Maxwell, United Australia Party MP for the seat of Fawkner. And this seat is so safe for the UAP in 1935 that Robert Menzies says, "Hey, Harold Holt, you're 27 years old, you have no experience, and absolutely no one in the seat of Fawkner has any idea who you are. I'm going to give you pre-selection, and you are going to win this by-election with a 60% supermajority and become the youngest member of parliament in the entire federal government." Did Menzies take a shine to Holt because of his political outlook or his proposed policies? No, because Holt didn't have any views of his own. He didn't have any proposed policies. He only knew Menzies because he was introduced by Menzies' cousin, because because all of them went to the same elite private boys' school. They all went to Wesley College, which of course means that all of them would have attended one or more dog funerals. Up next on our list is the Anzacs, who died in World War II. Harold Holt was going to be there with them. He was enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force as a gunner, but then he got called up to Parliament. And this one biographer clearly doesn't respect anybody's intelligence, because he genuinely tries to present that as if that was a hard choice for Holt. No, it wasn't. He chose a cushy job in Canberra over frontline combat because anybody would. It was not a difficult decision. Unfortunately, the Anzacs laid down their lives anyways, so that Harold Holt could step over them and not have to, and have a cushy job instead. And so that's on our list, dead bodies numbers 2 through 27,002. Up next on our list is Jeffrey Street, Henry Gullett, and James Fairbairn, who on the 13th of August 1940 all lost their lives in the same freak accident plane crash known as the Canberra air disaster. This is relevant for our story because these three men were senior members of the Menzies ministry, which became so short-staffed that Menzies made Harold Holt, who was 32 years old and had no experience, the Australian Minister for Labour and National Service, which is a job that he was so wildly unequipped for that one newspaper said that a young Mr. Holt was out of its depth, which is very funny. So that's dead bodies 27,003, 4, and 5. I promise I'm not lying. We're not even halfway through the list, so stick around for more of that. But also, what are you doing tomorrow night? Are you in Melbourne? Can you be in Carlton tomorrow at the Motley Bauhaus at like 8? I'm doing a comedy gig. I do comedy. I'm going to dress up like a caveman and talk about chocolate tomorrow night. And you should come say hi. I will hang out with you. But if you don't, that's cool too. I still am just grateful you're here. Stick around for more of Harold Holt, the man, the myth, the pool. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still needs this handrail that looks easy, looks simple. It took me 6 hours. Up next in our countdown of all the dead bodies Harold Holt had to step over in order for his mediocre ass to become Prime Minister, it's number 27,006, Ben Chifley. So Chifley was a Labour politician, he was the Prime Minister from 45 to 49, and he's regarded as one of the greatest we've ever had. Until one day he said that we should nationalise the banks, and this is how the Liberal Party and Menzies and Harold Holt basically got into power. Because if we nationalise the banks, then the public would have the right to choose who runs the banks. And that is something called communism. So Robert Menzies, leader of the Liberal Party, uses this as evidence that Australia is being invaded and undermined by evil communists. I mean, they're not, but it's the 1950s, everyone panics, and the Liberal Party is elected in a landslide. But unfortunately for Menzies and Harold Holt and the Liberal Party, Chifley's Labour Party maintained control of the Senate and used it to block their attempts to further deregulate the banks, and also block their attempts to ban being a communist, because nothing says liberalism quite like making it illegal for people to choose to not be a liberal. But the bill also gave the Australian Governor-General the power to point at someone and declare them a communist with absolutely no evidence. And if you're thinking, that wouldn't have ended well, it didn't start well, because when Menzies gave the second reading of this bill to Parliament in 1950, ASIO gave him a list of 53 trade union leader names, Australian citizens, and Menzies read these people's names out and said, these people are commies, and when we pass this bill, they will be in jail. And someone was like, what if you're wrong? And he's like, I won't be. Oh, I am. 5 of the people on the list were not communists. But this is a perfect example of what a calculating bastard Robert Menzies was. Because he doesn't care that he's being a complete hypocrite. I mean, all liberals are hypocrites, but he particularly does not care. This abuse of power is deliberate. They want to bait Chifley into defending the communists so they can call him a commie and then win more votes in the next election. But Chifley doesn't fall for it. He lets the bill pass. So not only does Chifley avoid the trap, the High Court of Australia throws out the communism ban bill, forcing Menzies to call a referendum. It is an extremely tight race until a miracle happens just 2 months before the referendum. Ben Chifley, who is 66 years old, drops dead from a massive heart attack. Overnight, the Labour Party loses one of the greatest leaders it has ever seen, and as his replacement, they get one of the worst, a man called Doc Evatt. How bad was he? Let me tell you 2 things about this man. 1, he was an outspoken defender of the White Australia policy, and 2, he is one of the founders of the State of Israel. I'm not making that up. Anyway, despite Chifley's absence, the referendum is very narrowly struck down. It's a margin of just 0.5%. And what actually saved us is the Irish Catholic community of Australia and the leadership of Melbourne's Archbishop Daniel Mannix, who was almost rabidly anti-communist, but he had seen the atrocities committed by the British government in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, where innocent Irish people were collectively punished for the crimes of revolutionaries. And then he said, up the rah. He didn't say that. He said, you cannot let any government have that kind of power. Which is great. Savour the victory, because for the next 20 years, the Liberal Party is effectively unopposed, and we descend into neoliberal hell. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre is looking clean and sparse, and I need to fix that. So let the clutterification commence. On April 13th, 1954, Robert Menzies, leader of the Liberal Party, announced in Parliament the existence of a massive Soviet spy ring in Australia. there wasn't, and he was lying. But welcome to the Petrov affair, the defining moment of Cold War paranoia in Australia, key to the Liberal Party's rise to power. So Vladimir Petrov is a secretary at the Russian embassy to Australia in Canberra, and in 1953 he decides he wants to defect to Australia, which historians try really hard to portray as a noble or brave thing to do. But Vladimir Petrov, if you actually read the things that he was doing before he defected, he was a hopelessly incompetent, low-functioning alcoholic con artist running away from the consequences of his own actions. So Petrov makes the carefully considered decision to open up to one of his friends about wanting to defect, by which I mean he gets blackout drunk and leaks it to Dr. Michael Bialogiski, who is insane, evil, stupid, looks like this, and is also an undercover part-time ASIO agent. So he tells his bosses about Petrov, asks for a raise. His bosses say no because you're evil and stupid, we don't trust you or like you. And he goes, okay, I'm going to pretend to resign to make ASIO want me even more. And then ASIO accepted his resignation and he lost his job. Anyway, so ASIO starts courting Petrov for defection, and Petrov finds it stressful. He starts drinking more and then gets in 3 car accidents, nearly runs over a cop. And seeing all of this, ASIO director Charles Spry goes to Robert Menzies and says, hey, I want to give this out-of-control alcoholic $300,000 of taxpayers' money for everything that he knows. And then we should have a big public royal commission to educate the public about the evils of communism. And then, if Robert Menzies is to be believed, he reluctantly agreed to dramatically announce a royal commission into espionage 3 weeks before a federal election he was slated to lose. He makes the announcement, and opposition leader Doc Evatt has some concerns. Concern number 1. This royal commission is very publicly accusing people of treason, including multiple Labour Party staff members, but you have refused to share the evidence for these accusations with anybody, including the accused themselves, making it impossible for them to prepare the case for their own defense. Which is concerning because you've used that evidence as justification for massively expanding the powers of the Royal Commission itself, which Menzies responded to by calling Evatt names. So Evatt, who recognizes this Royal Commission as a political attack on the Labour Party, he decides to step in and defend the accused himself because he's one of the most respected legal practitioners on the planet at this point. So on his first day as defense counsel, he gets the commission to release the redacted evidence, which the Royal Commission responds to, apolitically mind you, by banning him from the remainder of proceedings and then slagging him off to the press. Now this won't surprise anybody, but Petrov's information was overwhelmingly useless. The Royal Commission found nobody guilty of wrongdoing, found no evidence of a massive Soviet spying ring, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because just like Menzies' communism ban bill, this isn't about protecting Australia, it's about expanding police powers and tricking the Labour Party into defending communism so they can call them commies and then win the next election. And it's this deeply cynical strategy that is about to not just ruin the Labour Party for the next 20 years, but completely destroy Doc Evatt's life. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still needs this outdoor spa, which I'm going to make today while I talk to you about the Cold War in Australia. April 21st, 1954. This photograph is on the front page of every newspaper in Australia. Let me tell you the story. So this is Evdokia Petrov. She works at the Russian embassy in Canberra. She's a Soviet spy, and her husband, Vladimir Petrov, has just defected to Australia. If you want to hear about that, watch the previous episode of this series. In the photo, Evdokia is being dragged by Soviet goons through Sydney Airport because they're taking her presumably back to Russia to punish her for her husband's defection. And according to the official narrative, Australian officials are going to swoop in, intercept them at Darwin Airport. She's going to gratefully accept asylum, and her and Vladimir are going to live out their days in hiding in the southeast Melbourne suburb of Bentley East. If you're not from Melbourne, I'm giggling about that because Bentley is like a 20-minute drive from where they filmed Kath and Kim, which is, it's just weirdly genius to hide a Soviet spy there. Because if you work for the Soviet Union and they're like, we need you to go find the Petrovs, the last thing you're going to do is hop on a Cranbourne train change a Caulfield. Anyway, before I get distracted and wind up talking about the ethnography of Kath and Kim, because actually it's quite interesting. So Magda Zhubansky, the reason her character is called Sharon Strzelecki is because that's like a very Polish, it's a very Polish name. Kath and Kim is super Eastern European coded. Even Kel Knight, who is a super white, daggy Aussie guy, he's a butcher who makes sausages, and Kath is constantly wearing tracksuits. And I've gotten distracted, but there's actually a very specific reason for that. The reason it's so Eastern European is because the immigration minister in 1954 was Harold Holt, and he oversaw a massive population shortage, which was an issue because we were hoping to build a massive hydroelectric dam, and our main source of migrant labor was the British, and that was kind of drying up in the 1950s. Which isn't a problem at all, because plenty of people from neighbouring Asian nations would have loved to have lived and worked here, but Harold Holt's a Liberal MP. So they say, hey, let's not have any Asian people come here. Let's expand the definition of whiteness to include Eastern European people, Slavic people, people from Balkan nations who currently are not considered white. So these Eastern European laborers work on the Snowy Mountains scheme, they fulfill their visa requirements, and then they get dumped in, among many other places, the southeast suburbs of Melbourne around Lilydale, Frankston, and Kath and Kim's Patterson Lakes. And so the reason that the Petrovs are in Bentley and the reason that Kath and Kim is so Eastern European is because this wave of Eastern European immigrants, none of them spoke the same languages, none of them went to the same churches, but they were all expected to uphold this absurd myth of a white European Australia, which is ridiculous. No one has any idea what's going on. It turns Southeast Melbourne into a kaleidoscope of anachronistic fashion and language, which is the perfect place to hide a couple of Russians. Nobody's going to notice because no one knows what's going on. And it's also going to be really funny fodder for a really good sitcom. Anyway, the reason I know about this is because I grew up there. My grandparents only immigrated to Australia, only settled in Melbourne because of Immigration Minister Harold Holt. Yeah, my replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre needs these bins. Happy bin night, everybody. We made it. Did you put your bins out? It's bin night. This is Evdokia Petrova, and up till very recently, she and her husband Vladimir were Soviet spies at the Russian embassy in Canberra. But he defected, and now she's being kidnapped by Soviet goons. Lots to unpack. Firstly, let me tell you how this is all Robert Menzies' fault. So Vladimir Petrov, in the lead up to his defection to Australia, specifically requested of ASIO that they keep all of this quiet, at least until his wife Evdokia was somewhere safe, because he was certain that the Soviets might kidnap her in order to draw him out of hiding. ASIO hears his concerns and they agree to be discreet. Now, bearing in mind it's considered conspiracy theorizing to suggest that the Petrov affair was primarily a propaganda exercise designed to scare people into voting for the Liberal Party. Bearing that in mind, ASIO takes a meeting with Australian Solicitor General Kenneth Bailey, and he says on record that the Petrov affair would be, quote, a fruitful means of propaganda. This plan is then immediately relayed to Robert Menzies, who spills the tea to the entire planet, blindsiding Petrov so hard that he only learns about it the next day when he sees his own name on the front page of every newspaper in the country. And it gets worse, because this isn't even the thing that triggers the kidnapping of Evdokia Petrova, because she wasn't kidnapped. The Soviets were trying to rescue her. Let me explain. So while Petrov's negotiating his defection, ASIO says, here's a cool plan. Let's distract the Soviets by getting you to write a letter to your old workplace. So imagine you're Evdokia. You get to work and somebody hands you a letter. Dear colleagues, I am extremely emotionally unwell and I blame you for it. So I'm going to go make myself dead now. It's your fault. You can all bathe in my blood. Lots of love, Vlad. Now, the Soviets aren't distracted by this so much as they are immediately concerned for Evdokia's safety, so they're like, we need to get her back to the Soviet Union. So they rush Evdokia to Sydney Airport, but they are intercepted. On the tarmac, literally between them and their plane, is a horde of 2,000 screaming anti-communist protesters, half a dozen photographers, and a film crew, because someone at the Russian embassy leaked which flight Evdokia was going to be on. We don't know who they leaked it to. We don't know who organized this protest, but we do know that one of the people in attendance is a man named Bill Wentworth, who is a backbencher for the Liberal Party. He's like the Australian McCarthyist politician. And the reason that every newspaper in Australia reports the next day that Evdokia was begging for help, begging to be saved, is because Bill Wentworth took a bunch of statutory declarations from Russian speakers who claimed that's what they heard. Which they absolutely didn't. They were lying. Which we know because Evdokia herself gave a public statement in which she said, I was terrified and crying because I thought my husband was dead and there was an angry mob trying to rip me to pieces. No, I did not ask for help. Which is a direct result of ASIO's stupid distraction plan and Robert Menzies' publicity stunt in Parliament. Despite this, no newspapers ever issued a retraction, and Robert Menzies was never held accountable for personally instigating a riot that nearly got a woman ripped to pieces. And to understand why that is, I gotta tell you what happens next. It gets even stupider. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have these wiggledy-piggledy benches, so I'd better wiggle and pickle those, and also tell you more about the Cold War in Australia, because I think it's interesting. It's April 1954, and Liberal backbencher Bill Wentworth is standing among a crowd of anti-communist protesters, and they're watching helplessly as Evdokia Petrova, who's the wife of recently defected spy Vladimir Petrov, is bundled onto a plane, flown to Darwin so that she can be flown to Moscow, and then they're going to bake her into a big pie, because communists are evil. So Wentworth calls the Prime Minister's house, and as luck would have it, the entire Australian cabinet is there for a piss-up. I'm not joking. So Wentworth is like, me and a bunch of anti-communist protesters just fabricated a story that Evdokia Petrova was screaming out for help. And so good news first, the reporters believed us because communists are evil. We all know that. But the bad news is there's like a whole bunch of Australian authorities here. So now the reporters want to know why the cops just like let that happen. And yeah, it's looking really bad for the government. So you might want to do something about that. Anyway, bye. So Robert Menzies doesn't immediately panic, but then he turns on the radio and he hears a live news report. And it's like, hey guys, we're at Sydney Airport where the world's hottest woman has just been kidnapped by communists in front of every cop in New South Wales. What is the government doing? So Menzies calls an emergency cabinet meeting. Now, as soon as it becomes a cabinet meeting, an impenetrable shroud of secrecy descends. The only things that are ever publicized about cabinet meetings are the decisions that are made and who is present. Fortunately, they make some very telling decisions. It's clear that they're all drunk and unprepared because after this, Deputy Prime Minister John Blackjack McEwen, he gets a new nickname. They start calling him Don't Panic Jack. And secondly, either because they don't trust Bill Wentworth or because they're in on the lie with him, they decide they need someone to confirm with Evdokia herself on the plane that she wishes to remain in Australia. So they radio the pilot and they give him the mission. Someone needs to sneak past the guards and get her to confirm that she wishes to seek asylum. Now, if you're wondering how it's possible to sneak past guards on a plane with a capacity of 30 people, wonder no more, because as soon as they took off, Evdokia's guards cracked a couple beers and fell asleep, leaving Evdokia to move freely throughout the cabin the entire flight. So the captain approaches her and he says, do you wish to remain in Australia? And she says, no. And he goes, sends in a flight attendant. And the flight attendant's like, Evdokia, do you wish to remain in Australia? And Evdokia's like, no. And the captain's like, So he radios ground control and he says, Evdokia said she wishes to remain in Australia, which is a lie, but it doesn't matter because Evdokia mentions something else. She mentions that her guards are armed, which is technically still illegal even if you have diplomatic immunity. And so a hasty, drunken plan is concocted to ambush the Soviets on the tarmac at Darwin Airport and then offer asylum to a woman who has just said twice that she doesn't want that. And I really can't stress enough how close we came to sparking World War III just so that Bill Wentworth and Robert Menzies didn't have to admit, oh yeah, we lied, we exaggerated a little bit. But they didn't, and things get even stupider. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre needs this sign for the Malvern Swim Academy, who apparently watched this show. And to show my thanks for your support, I came up with a cool new slogan for you, and I really hope you like it. It's 5 a.m. April 21st, 1954. Soviet spy Evdokia Petrova and her two guards, their plane touches down in Darwin Airport for a refueling stop on the way back to Moscow. And as soon as Evdokia's party is finished disembarking, they are immediately swarmed by 15 armed Australian authorities, including a police superintendent whose name is Little John. Evdokia is yoinked off to the side for questioning, and then her two escorts, whose names are Zharkov and Karpinski, are surrounded by 14 cops who start demanding to know if they have any weapons. Now, the Soviets are armed, but they have no obligation to answer these questions, so they keep moving. One of the cops grabs Karpinski. Karpinski responds by trying to push past, and failing that, he hits a cop with his purse. The Australian authorities respond to this naked act of Soviet aggression by panicking, screaming, "He's reaching for his gun," and then dogpiling on him. So two cops are on either side holding each of his arms. A third one has pulled his jacket down, so it's pinned his arms helplessly to his sides. He's effectively in a straitjacket and also being manhandled by three cops. That's when a fourth cop is like, uh-oh, yeah, the boys are in trouble. I better get in there. So he runs up behind Karpinski and puts him in this headlock, creating an image that has since become an enduring symbol of Australia's moral victory over communist subversion. And what better symbol of Australian superiority than a photo of a cop applying excessive force to an incapacitated man? So while this ridiculous melee is happening, Evdokia is pulled to the side and approached by a man who says, "Evdokia, I am the governor of Darwin. Do you wish to seek political asylum in Australia?" And she says, "I don't know. Would you just kidnap me? Could you? This would all be a lot simpler and easier and safer for me if you would just come out and kidnap me. Also, did you kill my husband? Can I talk to him? Is he alive?" So the governor of Darwin's like, So he reports all of that back. And mercifully, the guy running this whole thing is like, okay, we're not going to kidnap her. That's too much. Let's get her on the phone to Petrov. So they set up a call and everybody's in the room, all the Soviets, all the Aussies. And she is like, "I don't believe this is my husband. My husband is dead." And she hangs up the phone. Let's go back to Moscow. But then she turns to the governor of Darwin and winks at him. So he goes, "Oh, do you want to speak to me in private?" And she says, "No," and walks away. So then they're all saying their final farewells, and the governor of Darwin is like, why would she wink? I'm going to ask again. So we ask her again, "Would you like to have a private chat with me, Evdokia?" And she says, "Sure." So they go into a private room, and Evdokia finally says, okay, I wish to remain in Australia, but I'm not signing anything, and I want to see my husband. So we go, sure, just hop in this car. All of the cops on site form a physical barrier to block the view of the Soviets while we bundle Evdokia into a car and take her not to her husband, but to Government House to rot in custody while we tell the press she's already defected so that she has no choice but to sign the papers officially seeking asylum in Australia. Now, if that's not kidnapping, I don't know what is. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still doesn't have this beautiful ensemble of round clock, square clock, and also some bushes. Tag yourself, which one are you? I'm the bushes. The Australian psyche in 1954 was woefully unprepared for how much of an icon former Soviet spy Evdokia Petrova was. To quote this historian who looks a lot like Mr. Bean, the male response to her was immediate and violent, which is a needlessly misogynistic way of saying she was extremely cool, but also she was woman. And this combination of woman and cool was immediately too much for us. We got overwhelmed, it freaked out. Let me tell you what happened. So we first meet Evdokia Petrova from a distance through these images in which she is a damsel in distress. She instantly becomes one of the most famous women in Australia, and a few months later, the day arrives, the first day of her testimony at the Royal Commission on Espionage. Let me tell you what we learned about her. Firstly, she is a captain in the Soviet secret police, and they are paying her, in today's money, $140,000 a year, and that's to work in Australia, a country where it won't be legal for women to be employed at all in the public service for another 13 years. We also learned that she's traveled the world. She's fluent in Russian, English, Swedish, and Japanese. And between rounds of questioning, she's like swiveling around in her chair, making small talk. She's making everybody laugh. Her interpreter is visibly crushing on her. Across the 4 days that she testified, she wears 4 separate immaculate tailored outfits. And when the Royal Commissioners are like, isn't there a uniform in the Soviet Union? And she's like, oh yeah, but not for me. I wouldn't wear that uniform. It's ungainly. And this is my favorite bit. But in front of her husband, her fellow spy, Vladimir Petrov, she reveals that this is not her first marriage. And when she married Vladimir, she didn't take his last name because she didn't like it. And then she laughed at him. And then the whole Royal Commission laughed at him. And then the newspapers also called him a peasant. Anyway, that's not even close to being the best bit, because the Petrovs at this Royal Commission, they're trying to push the narrative that they had to defect to Australia because they were being persecuted by the Soviets. And the way that Evdokia is being persecuted at the Russian embassy is the funniest story I've ever heard in my entire life. So Evdokia arrives at work at the Russian embassy, and under her desk in a display shelf is a giant portrait of Joseph Stalin. And she goes, oh, I guess we're just putting up photos. So she gets a couple of magazines and cuts out a photograph of an unnamed Hollywood actress with, quote, an eccentric hairdo, and puts it on his left. And then on his right, she puts a photograph of a dog playing the piano. She is immediately reported, and then she gets a formal reprimand from Soviet HQ in Moscow saying, Evdokia, your picture of a dog playing the piano is too close to your portrait of dear leader Joseph Stalin. Please move it. Which she does not. Instead, she mails to Moscow a diagram of the surface of her desk showing exactly where these pictures are. And she says, my picture of a dog playing the piano is nowhere near Stalin. Leave me alone. And then as payback, she embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Icon. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still needs all these plastic chairs that are not like the other plastic chairs, and also this wheelie bin full of program noodles. Quick recap, we're talking about William McMahon, who was the treasurer under Harold Holt. He was the absolute worst. Nobody liked him. He had no friends. And when he was 12 years old, he milked a horse with his mouth. So you're all caught up. So why did the Liberal Party not get rid of William McMahon? Because he wasn't just unpopular, he was radioactive. Like, not only does Malcolm Fraser, who is one of the Liberal Party's most conservative MPs, hate William McMahon, but so does the left wing. Like, Gough Whitlam called William McMahon a stinky little girl in Parliament. Even his wife, Sonia McMahon, did not like him. She said no to half a dozen marriage proposals from him until someone pointed out to her that she could be the First Lady of Australia if he became Prime Minister. And she was like, okay, I'll marry him now. And then we will give birth to Julian McMahon and he will play Cole in Charmed. Sorry, we're going off on a lot of tangents today, but if you've ever wondered how William McMahon felt about being so disrespected by literally everybody that he worked with, he thought everyone was jealous. He thought they were all jealous of how smart he was and how hardworking he was. He thought they were all threatened by his greatness, which is absolutely not the case, unless by greatness you mean the greatness with which he dressed, and that made people call him gay. Which we're not going to get into. So from 1949 until 1966, conservative politics was run by Robert Menzies. And if you don't know already, he looks like a Muppet. Just an amazing head on this man. So Robert Menzies knew that he could not trust William McMahon, but he kept him around because in 1959, Menzies caught William McMahon leaking secrets from cabinet, which is a sackable offense, but he didn't sack him. Instead, he drags McMahon into his office and he goes, "Did you leak secrets from cabinet?" And McMahon goes, kinda. And Menzies goes, "No, I want a straight answer." And he brings in his secretary and he's like, "She's going to write down every single word that you say, and then we're both going to sign that confession, and I'm going to put it in an envelope, and I'm going to put it in a safe. And this sword of Damocles is going to dangle over your head for the rest of your career. And if you cross me again, I will destroy you." And McMahon goes, "Okay, can I please have a pencil? I want to make some amendments to the confession." And if you are curious what that looks like, here it is. It's beautiful, it's perfect, but Menzies made a mistake. Because when he retired in 1966, he handed the keys to the Liberal Party to the new Prime Minister, Harold Holt, but he didn't give him the letter. And we don't know if this is because Menzies was old and sick and tired, or because Harold Holt didn't want to be the next Menzies. He was determined to be an urbane leader that people wanted to follow, rather than big, scary Sam Eagle. Whatever it was, as soon as Menzies was out of the picture in 1966, William McMahon started work on destroying Harold Holt. And we're going to talk about how deep this goes and what it has to do with Ronald Reagan. Next episode, stick around. It gets weirder. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs this spectacular arrangement of 11 sun lounges in a row, right next to the bins, and then on the other side of the bins, double cuck chair. Tag yourself. Which one are you? I'm cuck chair left. Question. What does the band Oasis have in common with Australian-Soviet relations circa 1954? The answer is that both of those things broke up for the exact same reason. Let me explain. So in case you're unaware, Oasis is a British rock band. It's two brothers, Noel and Liam Gallagher, until suddenly in 2009, Noel quits and there's no more Oasis. Nobody's super surprised, but nobody knows exactly why, until a 2013 interview where Noel Gallagher finally reveals why he walked away from one of the most lucrative jobs in the history of music. And the reason was that he got into an argument with his brother Liam, and Liam threw a plum at him. Liam threw a plum, no more Oasis. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, with that in mind, let's dial the clock back to Australia 1954. Let me tell you about the Evdokia Petrova meat pie incident. And if you've never heard that name before, I recommend going to my page and checking out these episodes to catch up. Or you could not do that and live the rest of your life in darkness and then die full of questions. You can do that as well. So immediately after Evdokia defected, the Soviet Union issued a statement. They accused her of embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Russian embassy. This prompted an immediate response from Australia's Prime Minister Robert Menzies, as well as McCarthyist Liberal backbencher W.C. Wentworth, who both called it, in the strongest terms imaginable, empty commie propaganda, which it absolutely wasn't. And Menzies also knew this, because we, in order to get Evdokia to defect, had to give her a written guarantee of immunity from prosecution for all of the embezzling that she and her husband Vladimir were doing at the Russian embassy. And this wasn't a surprise to us, by the way. Asio and Menzies and the Australian Federal Cabinet, we knew about the embezzlement. We knew that the Petrovs were con men the whole time, long before we decided to have the grandest and most public and theatrical Royal Commission in Australian history, and have all of that resting on the testimony of two witnesses who are documented con artists. You're just so stupid. Anyway, I bring up the embezzlement because it's true, and it's not the only accusation that the Russians make. Because also in this statement, Russian ambassador Nikolai Generalov accuses Evdokia Petrova of rocking up to the Russian embassy's New Year's party, New Year's Eve 1953, getting in a fight with his wife, and then throwing a meat pie in her face. Now, this was never proven, and Evdokia never admitted to it, but the way that Evdokia denies it, I'm just going to put it on the screen, and you just need to read it, and then look me in the eye and tell me that Evdokia did not throw a pie in that musty old cow's face. There's no way that she didn't do it. So there you have it, the meat pie that severed diplomatic ties between Australia and the Soviet Union, just like the plum that severed diplomatic ties between the Gallagher brothers. Now, if there's one thing I've learned from all of that, it's that an Aussie-Soviet reunion tour would be mad hectic. Thank you. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center is still lacking the backstroke bunting, the little, I don't know what these are called, but I got to make them today. POV, you are Harold Holt. You rock up for work on a Tuesday morning, April 13th, 1954, and your boss, the Prime Minister of Australia, Robert Menzies, calls a cabinet meeting, and he tells all of you, hey, a Soviet spy has defected to Australia, and I'm going to announce that in Parliament to the world at 2:30 today. And he turns to you and he says, hey, little Harry, and he pats you on the head. He gives you the task of going to the office of the Leader of the Opposition, Labour leader Doc Evatt, and getting a copy of his schedule so we know where he'll be when this big espionage announcement is made. During the walk to the opposition leader's office, you're thinking Harold Holt thoughts. Thoughts such as, I love my stepsons so much. In fact, the thing that I love the most about my stepsons is that they look exactly like me and were almost certainly conceived while I was hanging out with their mother in Melbourne, while their biological father, her husband at the time, was in another continent. So you get the opposition leader's schedule and you give it back to your boss. And as you do, you're thinking about this wonderful precedent that we have in our federal government, which is that if there's a threat to national security involving the Australian Secret Service, we tell the opposition leader about it as soon as possible. The reason we do this is so that we can work together, so that during times of national crisis, we don't have to worry about politicians across the aisle playing partisan politics and stabbing one another in the back. Because the safety of Australia as a whole is never worth trading away to score points over the opposition. You would have to be a parasite hell-bent on destroying the Australian organism to make that trade. With that in mind, you hand Robert Menzies the schedule and he notices that the opposition leader will be present for the announcement, but 6 hours later, he's got a flight to Sydney. So Menzies pushes the announcement back by exactly 6 hours. So that one of the most important announcements in Australian history happens while the leader of the opposition is uncontactable. Evatt and the Labor Party are completely blindsided and they play right into Menzies' hands because they rush out a statement that attempts to take the high road. They don't really know anything yet, so they agree to support the government and to take the threat of espionage seriously. They barely even mention that the leader of the opposition really shouldn't have been kept in the dark, especially because we are 6 weeks away from a federal election. Evatt won't become suspicious about the timing and handling of the announcement until it's far too late, when he has a phone call with the head of the Australian Secret Service, ASIO Director Colonel Charles Spry. And to give you an idea of what kind of guy Colonel Charles Spry is, this is a photo of him taken in 1954. He was rocking that mustache in 1954. And Colonel Charles Spry tells the leader of the opposition, Doc Evatt, I'm just a fan of Charlie Chaplin. No, he doesn't say that. He says, oh, you haven't been kept in the dark by accident. Menzies specifically instructed me not to tell you a thing. It wasn't a mistake. It was on purpose. And if you want to know anything about this espionage ring, you've got to go and beg Menzies for it. See you later. Learning about this betrayal irreparably damaged Doc Evatt's psyche. And POV, you're Harold Holt. Don't forget, you made this possible. And you're about to learn a lesson that you will never forget as you watch a man come completely undone. To be continued. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Center still needs these starting blocks, because right now there's nowhere to put these cones to block people from using the starting blocks, so I better do that today. When Harold Holt became the Prime Minister in 1966, he did so virtually unopposed. Now this begs the question, what happened to the opposition? Where was the Labor Party in the late 60s? To answer that, let me tell you about the time that Labor leader Doc Evatt in 1954 crashed out so hard and over something so stupid that it single-handedly destroyed the Labor Party. The story of Doc Evatt's demise starts with the Petrov affair, a topic I've already talked about way too much. That leads straight into the 1954 federal election, which Robert Menzies and his Liberal Party are able to narrowly win the same way they always win, by fear-mongering about war and then fabricating a big number and pretending that's what health spending will cost. Now, despite losing the election, the Labor Party is actually up 5 seats. They're doing well, but then the Royal Commission on Espionage kicks off, and the chairman of this commission announces that multiple members of Doc Evatt's personal staff have leaked information to the Soviets. And this information is so sensitive that we can't tell you what it is. Fortunately, thanks to FOI laws, we now know why the commission has said this, and it's because the information was embarrassingly worthless. Unless you love gossip, in which case this section, where current Member of Parliament Allegra Spender's grandfather is alleged to be a disgusting perv. Now, if Evatt had known the information was garbage, he probably wouldn't have done what he did next. Because he gets all mad and he starts criticizing the Royal Commission in Parliament and also to the press, which sets Menzies up to accuse Evatt of politicizing the Royal Commission, which Evatt, idiot that he is, responds to by shutting his mouth and then joining the Royal Commission as a defense counsellor so that he can advocate and have it not break the rules. His primary concern is that we've forgotten about innocent till proven guilty. Almost on cue, a French diplomatic worker named Madame Ollier is named in the Petrov papers as having leaked information to the Soviets. Now, there's no proof behind this accusation, but the French government responds by immediately arresting Madame Ollier, deporting her, where she's kept in detention for a year before she's eventually acquitted of all charges. Evatt is infuriated, he goes to the press, and the Royal Commissioners respond by banning him from the Royal Commission. This is the moment when Evatt's brain snaps in half. He becomes convinced that the Petrov papers are a fake and the whole thing is a conspiracy to destroy him. And to prove it, he writes a letter to the Soviet foreign minister asking if that's true. And Foreign Minister Molotov, he writes back and says, yeah, You're 100% correct. And Evatt goes, oh my God, and takes the letter into Parliament and tries to read it out like it's proof there's a conspiracy targeting him. The entire Australian House of Representatives, they respond by pissing themselves laughing. Robert Menzies later wrote about this moment that it would have been flying in the face of Providence not to seize this opportunity. He immediately calls an election, and it's a bloodbath. And just in case you forgot that we're still keeping count, that is dead body number 27,007 that Harold Holt stepped over to effortlessly become Prime Minister. Stick around. There's even more. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre currently doesn't have an exit, which means I should probably make one and then not use it because I'm never leaving. Harold Holt's last words are a serious contender for funniest last words of all time. He said, quote, "I know this beach like the back of my hand," and then stepped into the ocean and was immediately swept away, never to be seen again, which is quite a funny thing to do. But if you've been following this series, you'd know that it's not even close to the funniest thing he's ever said. Because in 1966, when he first became the Prime Minister, he famously remarked to his wife Zara, "I'm so pleased with myself for having gotten this job without having stepped over any dead bodies." Now, clearly what he meant by this is that he didn't feel like he had to resort to backstabbing or dirty tricks to get the top job. But the reason I find this funny is because Harold Holt was in politics for 30 years. And in all those decades, the most common reason that Harold Holt was promoted at work is that someone more senior than him died. And this isn't something that happened once or twice. This is by far the most common reason that he was ever promoted at work. So to get to the end of that career and be like, nobody died, I'm so proud, is quite funny. So I thought that would be a fun topic for one episode of this series. That was 2.5 months ago. I am now 10 episodes deep into this topic, and I'm still not done with the list. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to recap the list for you right now, and then we're all going to be back on track, and we're not going to feel like we're in the weeds anymore. Okay, here we go. Dead body number 1 is George Maxwell. He's the member for Fawkner, which is the federal electorate where you find Malvern, Caulfield, and South Yarra. It's one of the UAP's safest seats, and their leader, Robert Menzies, gives it to a 27-year-old Harold Holt, making him the youngest MP in Australian history. Dead bodies 2, 3, and 4 are the Canberra air disaster. 3 members of Australia's federal cabinet perish in the same plane crash. Robert Menzies is so short-staffed, he makes a 33-year-old Harold Holt the youngest federal minister in Australian history. Dead body number 5 is Labor leader Ben Chifley, who was one of the most effective opposition leaders the Labor Party ever had. That is until he died of a random massive heart attack age 65. Dead body number 6 was his replacement, Labor leader Doc Evatt, a man who went from being one of the world's most respected statesmen to one of the least, his behavior becoming so erratic and paranoid that it is speculated that he had arteriosclerosis, which restricted blood flow to his brain and accelerated the onset of dementia. Dead body number 7 was his replacement, Labor leader Arthur Calwell, a man who was so hilariously bad at his job as opposition leader that when Robert Menzies retired and handed the prime ministership to Harold Holt, he patted Harold on the head and he told him, as long as Arthur Calwell leads the Labor Party, you have nothing to fear. And last but not least is dead body number 8, Robert Menzies himself, the founder of the Liberal Party, and at the time of his retirement, the most elderly prime minister we have ever had. He was somewhere around 20,000 years old, which is, even for a vampire, that is quite an advanced age. He was 71. He wasn't a vampire that we know of. Anyway, that is the end of the list. Or so I thought. I found more. Stick around. I found more. It's not many more, but I found more. My replica of the Harold Holt Swim Centre still needs these PVC pipe pool platforms. So I'd better make these PVC pipe pool platforms, because then the pool will have PVC pipe pool platforms. We know less about Harold Holt than any other Prime Minister in Australian history. He died before he could write any memoirs. He had few, if any, close friends. And even his signature personality trait, his love for the ocean, is something he only got dragged into doing by his kids when he was in his late 40s already. So who was he before that? The answer is, we know very little, and what we do know is dark. Let's conclude our countdown of all the dead bodies that Harold Holt stepped over to become Prime Minister. Dead body number 9 takes us back to July of 1925, when Harold Holt was 17 years old and boarding at Wesley College, an elite private school in Melbourne's southeast suburbs. Now, Harold Holt's actually from Sydney. He had only moved to Melbourne as a result of his parents' divorce 7 years prior, which in Australia at that period of time is practically unheard of. What's even weirder is that Harold's dad seems to have gotten custody. The pair of them left Harold's mum behind in Sydney. And what's even weirder is that this seems to have been Harold Holt's idea. When he was 12 years old, he was like, "Hey Dad, I heard there's a great boarding school on St Kilda Road. Can I move to Melbourne and then never see my mum again?" And his dad's like, "Yeah." So jumping back to July 1925, when Harold is 17 years old, he takes an unprecedented break from school for a few days to go and visit his mum in Sydney. So when he gets back, his buddies are like, hey dude, is everything okay? He only replies to them with 2 words. She's dead. Those 2 words are the only recorded instance of Harold Holt acknowledging his mum's existence. From this point onward, with even less of a family to split his focus, Harold Holt is able to excel academically. He did not attend her funeral. Dead body number 10 comes in 1945. When Harold Holt was 37 years old, he is informed that his father, Tom Holt, had died in a private hospital aged 59 after a long battle with what was likely Parkinson's disease. When Harold received this news, he said absolutely nothing, because by this point in time, he and his father had barely spoken in 10 years. Not since his marriage to a woman named Lola Thring, who was 25 years his junior and who he had met through his son Harold Holt, because Harold Holt was Lola Thring's boyfriend at the time. Harold Holt's first serious romantic relationship with a woman that was 2 years younger than him ended with her becoming his stepmother. Harold Holt did not attend his father's funeral. Dead body number 11 happens in January of 1966 with the death of Harold Holt's auntie, the comedian and actress Vera Pierce. Vera was the closest thing Harold had to a parent, but she was a famous Hollywood actress, so their relationship took place long distance. Her funeral took place in London the day after Harold Holt became the Prime Minister. He sent flowers this time, but he did not attend her funeral. Instead, just like always, Harold had work to do. Now, there's one more person on this list, but they need their own episode, so stick around for that. PVC, Pipe Pool Platform.